Hey guys, a Victorian woman's morning ritual began not with fresh clean water but with perfumed sprays coating unwashed flesh and matted locks. Elaborate gowns concealed the accumulated perspiration, germs, and, well, offensive odours that built up over countless days. These ladies ran combs through louse-infested hair, bathed in reused water teeming with deceased insects, and trusted that ash and urine could enhance their beauty. What society once whispered about was actually the shocking truth that everyone chose to ignore. Tonight, we'll explore the disturbing realm of personal cleanliness concealed beneath the sophisticated facade of Victorian ladies. Before we continue, please consider liking this video and subscribing if you genuinely appreciate the content I create. Share in other comments where you're watching from and your current time. It's always intriguing to discover our global audience. Now lower the lighting, perhaps start a fan for some ambient sound, and let's begin this exploration together. Should someone have entered a Victorian lady's chamber at daybreak, they wouldn't find a wash basin filled with clear water awaiting her cleansing ritual. Rather, a dampened cloth soaked in vinegar or aromatic mixture would lie prepared on her vanity. She would gently dab it across her features, convinced this method was more secure than using plain water. Fresh water wasn't trusted, particularly in urban areas, where plumbing systems ran alongside sewage lines and where concerns about illness or cold temperatures persisted. The cloth created a mild burning sensation on her skin, while vinegar's sharp smell lingered on her face. This wasn't an individual woman's preference. This routine repeated itself in households both grand and modest, representing what society accepted as proper cleanliness. Fragrance came next immediately. Crystal bottles positioned elegantly beside looking glasses captured the early morning sunlight. The contents were potent and concentrated, formulated to mask any hint of perspiration or natural oils. She misted her throat, touched her pulse points, and worked the scented mixture through her tresses. The bedroom atmosphere became saturated with these aromas, which didn't dissipate but intensified with each additional application. It's almost comical that this fragrant cloud, celebrated as sophistication, frequently caused household staff to feel nauseated. However, for the lady herself, it represented evidence of social standing and moral character. A body cleansed with water might still suggest financial hardship, but a body saturated in expensive perfume could never be confused with the working class. The process wasn't delicate. Fragrances contained alcohol and essential oils that created burning sensations when used. Too frequently, women endured the resulting redness and discomfort as acceptable consequences of maintaining beauty standards. Their garments, multiple layers of heavy fabric, captured moisture against their flesh. Rather than washing properly, they simply applied additional perfume. Shawls and gloves received fragrant treatments before wearing. Even linens and drapery weren't exempt, saturated with scent until entire households carried identical aromas. The fragrance penetrated every space, adhering persistently to textiles that rarely underwent proper laundering. This behaviour also demonstrated deep-seated fears. Water, especially cold water, was considered harmful to one's constitution. Medical professionals warned of chills and nervous disorders, and families repeated these cautions until they became unquestioned customs. A vinegar-soaked cloth was viewed as protective armour, defending against unseen threats. Perfume accomplished more than concealing unpleasant smells. It was believed to combat them, purify the surrounding air, and serve as a barrier against corruption. Washing with water meant inviting danger. Coating oneself in perfume meant staying protected. The contradiction becomes more striking when considering the actual state of Victorian cities. Streets overflowed with coal residue, factory emissions, and the stench of horse waste. Households accumulated soot on surfaces and walls. People travelled daily through contamination, then returned to rooms heavy with unwashed materials. Yet the morning's first action wasn't removing grime, but concealing it beneath stronger odours. Comparing this practice to today would be like avoiding showers for 7 days while spraying countless bottles of cheap body spray, convincing ourselves we've solved the problem. The foolishness is obvious, yet in Victorian society it was standard procedure. Fragrance also held significance beyond personal cleanliness. It established social hierarchies. The impoverished couldn't purchase strong bottles of imported scents, so the smell of natural perspiration revealed their economic status. The affluent could afford to purchase the pretense of cleanliness. Perfume became a symbol of membership, an indicator that one belonged to respectable circles. Entering a drawing room without fragrance risked public embarrassment. Better to overwhelm others with artificial scents than permit even the slightest natural aroma. I find it unsettling to envision being trapped in those sealed parlours, surrounded by perfume layers so dense that breathing felt like inhaling thick smoke. While the ladies smiled and believed themselves perfectly presented, the intensity of their fragrances was overwhelming. Formulations required concentrated essences, animal musk, and tree resins. A single application persisted for hours, and multiple layers created an almost visible haze. At social gatherings where numerous women assembled in rooms with closed windows, the atmosphere became suffocating. Visitors felt dizzy. Staff members became sick, yet silence remained the expectation. Expressing discomfort appeared uncultured. Therefore, everyone suffered quietly. What mattered was projecting elegance, not ensuring the comfort of those forced to breathe the oppressive air. Young girls absorbed these practices early. Female children observed their mothers and imitated their behaviour. They applied scent to their own small wrists and necks, rehearsing for when they would face judgment as adults. The distrust of water and dependence on perfume were taught as lessons in proper conduct. Deviating from established customs would attract harsh criticism. Thus, the cycle perpetuated itself. An entire generation developed convinced that artificial fragrance equaled health and social respectability. Within homes, bottles were showcased like precious objects. Visitors could observe them gleaming on dressing tables, demonstrating refinement. Each morning commenced with identical ceremonies, the same aromatic clouds, the same water avoidance. Physical discomforts like skin irritation, headaches, or stomach upset were dismissed. These were minor prices compared to the greater objective of appearing sophisticated. This way, the custom became so deeply rooted that it appeared normal, even unavoidable. The truth, nevertheless, was contamination. Concealed beneath perfume, skin stayed unwashed, pores blocked with oils and debris. Gowns absorbed perspiration that never got rinsed clean. Scarves retained the combination of stale perfume mixed with human odours. Behind the mask of roses and lavender existed the reality of deterioration. The more extensively it was hidden, the more extensively it flourished. Yet as long as outward appearances remained intact, society gave its approval. The morning ceremony of vinegar cloths and perfume bottles remains today as one of the most revealing examples of Victorian hypocrisy. It exposes a civilization that valued appearance over wellness, fantasy over reality. It demonstrates how fear and fashion combine to establish practices that now appear ridiculous. The notion that water could cause harm, while perfume could purify, serves as a reminder of how conviction can override logic. They trusted perfume was sufficient to maintain proper appearances. Underneath the gowns, perspiration and grime remained pressed against their flesh. The refined fabric merely served as a covering for accumulated hidden contamination. The vision of a Victorian lady strolling in public presented apparent sophistication. Her dress swept along the ground, decorated with ribbons, lace, and often enhanced with intricate needlework. To observers passing by, she conducted herself with grace, her attire suggesting prosperity culture, and virtue. However, beneath this presentation existed a truth that nobody wanted to recognize. The very clothing that indicated her position simultaneously served as repositories of contamination, perspiration, and harmful bacteria. The deeper one examines past the polished surface, the more contradictions emerge. The standard dress wasn't a single piece. Women donned 3, 4, and occasionally 5 fabric layers, each pressed firmly against the others. The external layer was most ornate, intended for viewing and admiration. Underneath came heavy skirts, petticoats, and undergarments that adhered to the body. The innermost layer was the chemise, in direct contact with skin, absorbing perspiration continuously. This construction created the desired volume and silhouette admired during that period. However, it also formed a heated enclosure where moisture and dirt couldn't escape. Garments that appeared magnificent on streets concealed the stench of bodies trapped beneath them. Regular clothing washing wasn't considered feasible. A single gown could weigh multiple kilograms, and laundering demanded hours of soaking, scrubbing, and drying. For numerous families, the concept of cleaning all those layers more frequently than monthly was impractical. Instead, perspiration and filth accumulated silently. Stains on outer gowns might be hidden with ribbons or extra lace, but inner garments remained untended. A chemise worn directly against skin might be used for a week or longer before replacement. The fabric darkened with sweat and absorbed oils, becoming an ideal environment for bacterial growth. It's almost ridiculous that the very emblem of purity and femininity was, in reality, a collection of unwashed cloth saturated with bodily secretions. The physical sensation was oppressive, with corsets constricting the waist and petticoats weighing down. Air movement was virtually impossible. Even during cool weather, women perspired under the burden of multiple layers. During summer, the discomfort became intolerable. Yet since the outer layer projected control and sophistication, the concealed suffering was overlooked. Removing layers publicly would have been scandalous. The standard of presentation demanded endurance regardless of personal sacrifice. We might question why women accepted this burden. The explanation lies in that era's culture. Cleanliness was defined not through actual washing, but through external presentation. A pristine gown, even if only superficially maintained, mattered more than washed skin or laundered undergarments. Wearing multiple layers signified modesty and moral character. The weight of clothing symbolized self-discipline. In such an environment, admitting discomfort or seeking daily garment changes risked appearing wasteful or inappropriate. Compared to present times, it would be like wearing identical workout clothes daily for a week, spraying them with perfume, and still expecting others to admire them as symbols of elegance. The practice seems horrifying now, but it wasn't questioned then. Disease discovered opportunities here. Damp cloth pressed against bodies became breeding grounds for infections. Skin rashes, sores, and fungal conditions were widespread, though seldom discussed openly. Medical professionals sometimes recommended lighter garments, yet fashion dominated over medicine. Women endured silently, frequently blaming their own frailty instead of the clothing itself. What mattered was the facade. As long as the outer gown sparkled publicly, the hidden layers could remain unchanged. The lower classes mimicked these practices as much as possible. Even lacking money for fine gowns, they layered inexpensive fabric to copy the style. The outcome was identical: sweat trapped in cloth, dirt absorbed day after day. The illusion of sophistication spread beyond the wealthy, influencing expectations throughout society. The pursuit of elegance ensured that hygiene remained secondary. I can't help but imagine the exhaustion of carrying such weight daily, the skin chafing underneath, and the awareness that beneath each ribbon and lace was nothing but unwashed fabric pressing against the body. The odour was unavoidable. Servants who assisted women dressing couldn't ignore it, but they remained silent. Layers of perfume were applied to mask the smell, combining with perspiration scent to create something far more offensive. In crowded locations, such as theatres or ballrooms, the mixture became unbearable. Yet commenting on it was unthinkable. Everyone pretended that the smell of refinement was natural. Silence proved safer than honesty. Practical cleaning attempts were minimal. Women might hang their gowns near open windows to air them, but actual washing was unusual. Some rubbed small areas with cloths dipped in starch or vinegar, but this only relocated the dirt rather than eliminating it. Outer layers received the most attention while chemises and petticoats were neglected. The unseen layers, pressed tightly against skin, bore the greatest burden. The contradiction was remarkable. The same society that condemned street filth tolerated it in their homes and clothing. External elegance excused internal decay. A woman was evaluated by the shine of her outer gown, not by the condition of the layers beneath. This disconnect reveals how profoundly appearances governed Victorian life. The gown became a symbol of respectability, even while it concealed the very opposite of cleanliness. Clothing manufacturers and laundresses profited from this system. They knew women would purchase more lace and ribbons to hide stains rather than wash complete garments. Fabric merchants encouraged the layering fashion since more cloth meant increased sales. The system continued because it served the economy, not because it made sense for hygiene. Questioning it meant challenging fashion itself, and few dared attempt that. The daily reality persisted. Sweat soaked into undergarments. Odours were concealed under perfume, and stains were disguised with decorations. Gowns were admired publicly while their contamination multiplied privately. This wasn't a mistake made by a few individuals. It was the common routine of millions of women, accepted without question, repeated year after year. The elegant outer gown, therefore, was less a sign of refinement than a disguise. Beneath its folds lay evidence of negligence, carefully hidden but known by those who lived within it. The very weight of the fabric pressed the truth deeper, ensuring it stayed invisible. To observe a Victorian lady was to witness an illusion. To imagine the inner layers was to face reality. The hair that crowned these women carried its own secrets. Combs and powders substituted for soap and water. What developed beneath the braids was worse than anyone cared to acknowledge. Victorian women's hair was praised as a symbol of beauty. Thick ringlets, carefully woven braids, and complex updos were considered indicators of sophistication. On the surface, hair appeared polished and magnificent, frequently decorated with ribbons or jewelled ornaments. Yet behind this external showcase was a practice that permitted filth to accumulate unnoticed. Hair was seldom washed with water. Instead, powders were sprinkled through the strands, intended to absorb oil and create a matte finish. These powders contained perfume, creating the impression of freshness while hiding the truth underneath. The procedure was straightforward but misleading. A woman might bend over her table while a servant scattered scented starch or rice powder onto her scalp. The hair was then brushed gently enough to distribute the powder, but not enough to disturb the carefully constructed style. The outcome looked refined in the mirror. To onlookers, the woman appeared cultured and well-maintained. In truth, the powder merely covered the accumulation of oil and sweat that had been building for days. The scalp remained dirty, and the strands grew heavy with build-up. It's almost absurd that what was celebrated as the pinnacle of feminine elegance was nothing more than greasy hair disguised with white powder. Water was avoided for hair, just as it was for skin. It was considered dangerous, capable of weakening health or damaging the strength of the strands. Soap was harsh, and rinsing was challenging in homes where baths were already uncommon. Instead, powders became the norm. They gave hair fuller volume and carried strong scent, both of which matched the period's ideals. But along with the volume came a silent invitation for parasites. The insects flourished in the warm, unwashed environment, feeding on the scalp while hidden beneath braids and pins. Once arranged, hair wasn't undone for several days. Women frequently slept with their braids and buns still secured, covering them with cloths to preserve the style intact. This saved mourning time, but trapped dirt and sweat against the scalp. Lice reproduced rapidly in such conditions, their eggs adhering to strands while their bodies moved freely beneath the layers. Combs were used daily to adjust the style, but these combs were rarely cleaned. Oil, skin particles, and even remains of crushed lice stuck to the comb teeth, ready to be dragged back through the hair the following day. The concept of cleanliness didn't extend to hygiene as we comprehend it today. To Victorians, clean hair meant hair that appeared smooth, smelled perfumed, and maintained its position. Actual washing was secondary. A fashionable woman might go weeks without allowing water to touch her head. Instead, she depended on powders, combs, and perfume to preserve the illusion. Compared to modern practices, it would be like refusing to wash one's hair for a month and only using dry shampoo and perfume each morning, all while pretending it was perfectly sanitary. The difference is that in Victorian England, nobody questioned the practice. The burden fell heavily on servants who managed their mistress's hair. They brushed through strands heavy with oil and powder, dealing with the smell that transferred to their own clothes and hands. Some maids were assigned to remove lice directly, using fingers or cloths to crush them, an unpleasant task that was rarely mentioned. The wealthy could tolerate infestation as long as it remained concealed beneath polished hairstyles. Appearances outweighed comfort. Hair accessories contributed to the problem. Ribbons, combs, and jewelled pins were frequently reused for weeks without cleaning. They collected powder and sweat, then transported lice from one hair section to another. Shared among sisters or within families, they spread infestation from head to head. Still, the accessories gleamed brightly, distracting from what lay beneath. The sight of a sparkling comb or silk ribbon was sufficient to maintain the illusion of refinement. I can't help but imagine the discomfort of lying down at night, scalp itching, hair heavy with dust, yet still believing this was the proper standard of beauty. Public gatherings amplified the issue. In theatres, ballrooms and parlours, women sat side by side, their hair towering in elaborate formations. The air smelled of perfume, powder and stale oils. But the crowd accepted it as fashionable. The reality of crawling lice was ignored, even though it was widespread knowledge. Those who whispered about infestations did so privately. Speaking of it, openly risked offending entire classes of women. Silence preserved dignity, even while heads itched beneath jewels and silk. Medical guidance existed, but was weak. Some doctors recommended occasional washing with vinegar solutions, yet few women followed this counsel. The inconvenience outweighed the potential advantages. A woman who released her hair to wash it risked destroying her carefully managed appearance. In a world where appearance defined morality and value, few were willing to take that chance. Washing remained unusual, and lice remained widespread. The contradiction was evident. A society obsessed with appearances tolerated contamination beneath the surface. Women spent hours arranging curls, securing braids, and adorning themselves with perfumes while ignoring the insects thriving just out of sight. This wasn't a hidden shame, but a tolerated reality integrated into daily life. The sight of a refined lady was simultaneously a display of elegance and a reminder of the infestation hidden beneath. Victorian hair, like their gowns, bore the mark of contradiction. From the outside, it represented elegance, sophistication, and order. From within, it was filthy, crawling, and stifling. The powders intended to preserve cleanliness became the ideal breeding ground for lice to flourish. The brushes designed to manage style dragged dirt deeper into the hair. Every day, the greater the focus on appearance, the more terrible the concealed reality grew. Ladies suffered through the irritation, believing that attractiveness required pain. Hair that sparkled under candlelight was frequently hair that hadn't seen water in months. The powders accumulated, the scalp burned, and the lice reproduced. Still, society embraced this, applauding the ladies who endured it with grace. The quiet that encircled this custom was born from shame, vanity, and convention. It permitted the issue to continue, concealed behind fragrances and hairpins, celebrated from a distance, yet intolerable when examined closely. They refused to challenge the lice, for doing so meant challenging the foundation of sophistication itself. They simply added more powder, more fragrance, and more layers of pretense, thinking this would suffice. The reality, though, was moving just below the surface, and it was inevitable that it would demand recognition. Hair that appeared refined in society was infested underneath. The irritation became so overwhelming that extreme solutions were created. Some ladies actually held their heads above flames to burn the lice to death. The battle against lice in Victorian hairstyles frequently resulted in drastic remedies. Powder and fragrance could mask the odour, but they couldn't prevent the movement under the scalp. When the itching intensified and the bugs multiplied, some ladies resorted to fire. The logic was straightforward. Heat could eliminate what powders couldn't. A fireplace, constantly lit in the household, became an instrument for what they considered cleanliness. The image of a woman leaning toward the flames, her hair fanned out as though drying, wasn't unusual. Maids occasionally held brushes near the fire, heating the bristles before pulling them through thick braids, hoping the warmth would eliminate lice and eggs attached to the strands. The technique was primitive and hazardous. Long hair, thick with powder and oils, absorbed the heat rapidly. The scent of scorched strands combined with perfume and grease filled the air with a harsh, suffocating smell. It seems almost absurd that something portrayed as refined beauty concluded with women roasting their hair like flesh over a fire. Yet this was viewed as sensible. Without effective solutions, families accepted the danger. Some ladies believed it was the only method to control infestations, particularly when water was shunned completely. The procedure frequently damaged hair. Frayed ends, burned spots, and broken braids were typical outcomes, but looks remained paramount. Ladies chose to tolerate a ruined section of hair rather than confess lice to anyone. The act of positioning one's head near flames was never mentioned in proper society, but it was a whispered truth. Servants observed it most clearly. They were commanded to prepare the fireplace and hold instruments close to the flames while inhaling the bitter mixture of burning hair and perfume. The smell persisted long afterward. Rooms became thick with the stench of smoke and charred oil. Drapes soaked it up, linens carried it, and garments retained it for weeks. But the practice persisted. Families thought the smell demonstrated that lice had been destroyed. Some even believed the scent itself provided protection, preventing future infestations. The reality was less impressive. Hair burned quickly, but lice frequently survived in the roots, protected from the momentary blast of heat. Still, ladies repeated the ceremony. Terror of lice exceeded terror of fire. A woman might lean perilously close, her face flushed by the heat, while servants hoped her hair wouldn't ignite. Mishaps were unavoidable. There are accounts of ladies losing substantial portions of their hair when flames spread too rapidly. Some were left with bare patches, others with hairlines forever changed. Compared to today, it would be like attempting to sanitize a toothbrush by thrusting it into a campfire and being shocked when it burns. The foolishness is obvious to us, but it wasn't amusing for those who experienced it. Fireplaces themselves were hardly sanitary. Dust, grime, and smoke covered everything. To push hair into that environment meant bringing more filth back onto the scalp. Brushes heated in the flames frequently carried soot directly into the hair roots. The effort to kill lice only introduced new layers of grime. Yet this paradox mattered little. In a world where lice were inevitable, any effort at control was preferable to none. Some ladies made the practice a habit. On particular nights when the house was calmer, they would sit beside the fire, brush in hand, leaning forward repeatedly. Children occasionally observed. Understanding that such a scene was normal, maids helped, separating sections of hair and drawing heated brushes through them. What appeared like grooming from afar was, actually, a war against invisible parasites. The risk extended beyond the person. In homes where multiple women lived together, a fire accident could endanger the entire residence. Hair ignited easily and flames travelled fast. A single error could spread fire from head to drapes, from drapes to furniture, and eventually to the entire house. Families understood this, but continued. The humiliation of lice exceeded the fear of fire. Physicians sometimes cautioned against such techniques, but their opinions carried minimal influence. Without modern shampoos or effective lice remedies, ladies clung to tradition. Perfume and powders offered the appearance of cleanliness. Fire promised the appearance of control. Together, they established the limits of Victorian hair maintenance. For the ladies themselves, there appeared no alternative. They were caught between appearance, terror, and inadequate solutions. I can't help but envision the blend of fear and resolve in a woman's expression as she leaned over the flames, knowing she might burn herself, but convinced that this was preferable to admitting infestation. The tale of burning hair over fireplaces shows much about the contradictions of the period. It speaks of a society where knowledge had little influence against tradition, where fear of disgrace exceeded fear of harm, and where appearances required sacrifices that approached self-destruction. It also shows how ladies bore the burden quietly. Their pain was personal, their solutions desperate, and their dangers constant. Yet the external appearance of refinement was never permitted to shatter. Ultimately, the technique did little to alter the situation. Lice flourished in homes despite fire, powders, or perfume. The pattern of infestation and attempted elimination repeated continuously. The ladies of Victorian society remained imprisoned, casualties of fashion and fear, while the scent of singed hair lingered in their homes. They thought this was refinement, but truly, it was desperation disguised as dignity. The contradiction was hidden in plain view, waiting to be recalled as one of the most peculiar practices of the time. Ladies leaned into fire, scorched their hair, and still harboured lice in the roots. The more they attempted to eliminate it, the more the problem returned. Hair was left fragile, homes reeked of smoke, and the insects persevered anyway. They were not conquered, only burned around the surface. The fire ceremonies were startling, but what existed beneath the dresses was even more disturbing. Ladies lived without what we now regard as basic clothing. They accepted the absence of undergarments as entirely normal. What it produced beneath the fabric was more troubling than lice in the hair. Victorian dresses were lengthy, layered, and weighty, and under all that material, something unexpected was absent. Ladies did not wear undergarments in the manner we picture today. The concept of a closed garment beneath the dress was deemed inappropriate, even pointless. Instead, dresses extended to the feet and were stacked with numerous layers that served as shields against the gaze of observers. This barrier of cloth was believed to offer sufficient modesty and protection. To Victorians, the presence of undergarments was nearly unnecessary. The absence of undergarments produced consequences that were seldom recognised. With no shield between the body and the fabric, perspiration soaked directly into the layers of skirts and petticoats. Body fluids stained the inner garments, absorbed daily. With no efficient way of being cleaned rapidly, the dresses became heavy, not just from fabric, but from the build-up of moisture and germs. It seems almost laughable that what was celebrated as modesty was actually a direct invitation for filth to settle nearer to the body. But to Victorian ladies, this was not shameful. It was the measure of respectability and questioning. It would have appeared foolish. The practice also showed a misunderstanding of health. Without a layer of cloth to shield, the skin chafing was frequent. Irritations developed where fabric rubbed too harshly, and infections spread silently. Physicians occasionally warned of the dangers, but society remained firm. Undergarments were connected to impropriety, and so they stayed uncommon. Ladies endured discomfort because appearance mattered more than comfort. As long as they seemed virtuous publicly, the private price was overlooked. The structure of dresses encouraged this pattern. Skirts reached the ground and contained numerous layers, each trapping warmth. Petticoats and chemises pressed against the body, absorbing sweat that had no means to evaporate. Corsets constricted the waist, further limiting airflow. The outcome was a hot, moist environment where germs thrived. Still, ladies carried themselves with elegance, the weight of the dress concealing the reality beneath. Compared to modern standards, it would be like walking through summer in a heavy jacket every day without a shirt underneath, convinced that nobody would detect the discomfort or the odour. The foolishness is clear to us, but it was accepted without question then. This lack of undergarments was also practical. Dresses were challenging to handle. Adding more layers of clothing beneath would have made dressing even slower and more complicated. Instead, ladies chose what seemed simplest. They believed the bulk of the fabric was adequate protection. What mattered most was avoiding scandal, not ensuring cleanliness. The long skirt itself was regarded as a barrier, a defence against exposure. What lay underneath was never meant to be mentioned. Servants who washed clothing saw the truth most clearly. They managed dresses stained and heavy with sweat, lifting fabrics that stuck together from dampness. The job of cleaning was nearly impossible without undergarments. To absorb the first layer of dirt, every garment bore the complete burden. Washing such heavy material required hours, sometimes days, and frequently the dirt was only spread rather than eliminated. For poorer ladies who couldn't afford regular cleaning, the problem worsened. Dresses became breeding grounds for germs, yet they continued to be worn with pride. I can't help but feel disturbed when I think of these ladies, admired publicly as examples of virtue, while knowing that beneath the fabric their bodies were constantly pressed against unwashed clothes. The social significance of this absence was strong. It became part of the moral standard of the era. Undergarments, as we know them, were linked to sexuality and therefore rejected. To wear none at all was considered purer, cleaner in the moral sense, even if not in the physical sense. This contradiction defined much of Victorian life. What mattered was the outward show of virtue, not the hidden truth of cleanliness. The discomfort was continuous. Heat accumulated beneath the layers. Sweat gathered, and yet nothing changed. Ladies tolerated it, convinced that this was the cost of respectability. Husbands, physicians and servants knew the truth, but no one openly questioned it. The silence that surrounded the practice was stronger than the evidence of smell, stains, or sickness. It was a silence that protected appearances while permitting suffering to persist. The absence of undergarments also affected how ladies moved. Long skirts restricted their steps, and without protection beneath, they had to be even more cautious in how they sat, walked, or bent. Every movement was limited, dictated not only by fashion, but also by the risk of revealing too much. This added another layer of discomfort to daily life. Yet still, the dresses were worn proudly, and the tradition continued. For poorer ladies, the problem was worse. They had fewer dresses to alternate and couldn't afford frequent cleaning. Sweat, dirt, and stains remained far longer, sometimes until the fabric itself deteriorated. Their reality was one of constant contact with unwashed clothes, a cycle of discomfort that never truly ceased. The wealthy might have had more fabric and more perfume, but the basic truth remained identical. Beneath every dress, the body pressed directly against layers that never received proper care. The contradiction between appearance and reality was once again revealed. To observe a Victorian lady was to see modesty and refinement. To imagine the unseen was to recognise neglect and decay. What was praised as pure and proper was in truth unsanitary and damaging. But society valued modesty above cleanliness, and so the practice continued day after day, year after year. The dresses appeared elegant, but beneath them the truth was undeniable. Sweat clung to fabric, germs thrived, and discomfort was endured silently. Ladies accepted this reality as normal, convinced it was necessary for respectability. They may have carried themselves with grace publicly, but their private suffering told another story. The absence of undergarments, far from being a sign of purity, was one of the many contradictions of the era. They believed modesty required sacrifice, even when that sacrifice was their own comfort and health. Dresses trailed along the floor while the skin pressed directly into the fabric. The outcome was dirtier than anyone acknowledged, and what ladies applied to their faces each morning made the situation even more hazardous. Each morning in Victorian homes, many ladies sat before mirrors and prepared their faces not with creams that nourished the skin, but with powders made from poison. White powder containing lead, or sometimes arsenic, was spread evenly across the face, down the neck, and in some cases, even along the arms to keep the skin the same tone. To appear pale was to appear refined, free from the signs of work and sunlight. The pale surface stood as a mark of status, and so the ritual continued. Each day, the powder had an instant effect. It lightened the skin and gave the appearance of smoothness. Wrinkles, spots, and blemishes vanished beneath the chalky layer. For a few hours, the lady looked as society expected, delicate, untouchable, and elegant. But the truth beneath was different. The powder did not cure or protect. It penetrated pores, irritated the skin, and carried toxins into the body. It seems almost ridiculous that what was praised as elegance was actually the gradual poisoning of one's own face. Yet in Victorian culture, this was not questioned. The white mask was praised and the suffering it caused was ignored. The effects were apparent quickly. Skin became parched, red and peeling. Some ladies developed rashes that spread across their faces. Others suffered from painful cracking or sores that never fully healed. But rather than abandon the practice, they applied more powder to hide the damage. The cycle repeated itself. The skin grew worse, the need for powder grew stronger, and the poison continued to penetrate deeper. To many, this was considered normal. Beauty required sacrifice. Redness and itching were dismissed as minor inconveniences compared to the risk of appearing unfashionable. Even servants who witnessed the damage closely said nothing, for their role was to assist, not to judge. Ladies endured the pain quietly, convinced that the white face they presented to society was worth the hidden suffering. Arsenic and lead powders were not scarce luxuries. They were widely available, sold in stores and by travelling merchants. Some formulas were handed down in families, mixtures of chalk, vinegar and metals. Perfume was added to hide the smell, creating the illusion that these powders were gentle. They were applied with soft cloths or brushes, creating a ceremony that felt refined even as it spread toxins onto the skin. Compared to today, it would be like rubbing industrial paint onto the face each morning, calling it skincare and convincing oneself that the pain was a sign of effectiveness. The practice appears shocking now, but then it was considered a mark of class. The obsession with the paleness of skin ran deep. Pale complexions were linked to virtue, while tanned skin was associated with work and poverty. A respectable woman had no alternative but to preserve this false paleness. Even as her health deteriorated, she held tight to the facade. Social expectations carried more weight than personal well-being. The ghostly complexion served as an unspoken mark of class. The lasting effects proved catastrophic. Continuous poisoning caused hair to fall out, teeth to rot, and bodies to weaken. Many women developed shaking hands or diminishing vision. These symptoms were often dismissed as natural delicacy rather than signs of daily toxic exposure. Physicians sometimes voiced concerns, but lacking contemporary knowledge or standards, their cautions fell on deaf ears. The powders stayed on store shelves while women kept purchasing them. I find myself disturbed when imagining these women graciously greeting guests at social events, their faces coated with poison, their skin underneath blistering and peeling, yet none willing to confess the reality. The contradiction grows deeper considering the moral culture that surrounded these women. They were meant to represent virtue and sophistication, while their mourning rituals slowly destroyed their own bodies. The powders represented grace to the public, but marked deterioration in private. What appeared beautiful from a distance caused agony up close. Still, the custom continued widespread, unchallenged by those who profited from marketing it. In homes throughout cities and villages, the mourning ritual played out repeatedly. A looking glass, a towel, a jar of white powder, and the careful hand of a woman intent on preserving her social standing. She dismissed the burning sensation on her skin, the flakes dropping onto her clothing, and the silent dread that the harm might be lasting. Only the pale reflection staring back mattered. In this struggle, she wasn't isolated. It was the common destiny of numerous women, connected by identical pressure, confined by the same expectations. The ceremony of daily whitening powder remains today as one of the most glaring contradictions of Victorian society. It demonstrates how profoundly looks could override logic, how the pursuit of elegance drove women to damage themselves daily. It also exposes the quiet conspiracy that surrounded these customs. Everyone witnessed the results, but nobody questioned them. The facade of whiteness was preserved regardless of the price. Underneath, women grinned through searing skin, convinced that suffering was simply the cost of being respectable. Powder provided them with faces that appeared smooth and fair beneath. Skin split and burned with each application. What they kept under their pillows at night proved even more peculiar than the powders they applied during the day. In the bedchambers of Victorian women, nighttime brought its own bizarre ceremonies. Before retiring, some would position an onion or sometimes orange peel close to their faces. They believed the scent would absorb bad odours from the mouth and cleanse the breath throughout the night. To them, this appeared to be a natural form of defence, a method to purify without effort. The onion or peel rested on the pillow or underneath it, a silent protector against foul air. When dawn arrived, the item was thrown away and the pattern began anew. The faith in such treatments reflected the suspicion of modern cleanliness. Toothbrushes were uncommon, and only a handful of women possessed them. Even those brushes were primitive and typically made from hog bristles that deteriorated quickly. For most homes, there was no daily brushing, no tooth powder, and no fresh water rinse. Instead, makeshift solutions filled the void. The onion, the citrus skin, and occasionally dried plants were put to use. They were basic, accessible, and thought to be harmless. It seems almost ridiculous that a culture that prized refinement so highly would accept a reeking onion as an instrument of elegance. Yet this was viewed as not only reasonable, but wise. Mourning habits were built upon these nocturnal practices. Women chewed dried tree bark, blossoms, or small herb pieces to cover their breath. Mint, clove, or rose petals were occasionally selected, but supply fluctuated. The goal wasn't about eliminating germs or cleaning teeth. It was about concealing odour, projecting a veneer of respectability, while the truth underneath remained untouched. A mouth rinsed with vinegar or wiped with fabric was considered adequate. The illusion of freshness counted far more than genuine cleanliness. Toothbrushes were available, but regarded as extravagances. Those who could purchase them didn't always employ them correctly. Brushes were shared among family members, passed from person to person. Sometimes unwashed, they sat on bedroom surfaces or near chamber vessels, gathering dirt and fungus. Most women, however, never handled one. For them, fabric and salt took the place of bristles and paste. A cloth soaked in salt was rubbed along the gums, an action more ceremonial than useful. Compared to modern standards, it would be like cleaning the mouth with a napkin dipped in table salt and calling it dental hygiene. The idea is disturbing now, but then it was routine. Rot followed, teeth darkened, breath turned putrid, and gums inflamed with infection. Yet in paintings and social gatherings, women smiled despite it all, believing that fragrances and surface treatments concealed the truth. Family members and household staff accepted the smells as natural. Oral disease was viewed as unavoidable, another burden of human existence. To address it seriously was beyond many people's imagination. The cultural silence spoke volumes. Mouth hygiene wasn't a topic for proper conversation. To mention it directly was deemed vulgar. Instead, improvised methods were shared quietly among women, whispered as suggestions or inherited as family customs. The onion under the pillow, the peel beside the bed, or the cloth dipped in salt. All these became routines that were followed without doubt. I find it troubling to picture a household filled with the sharp smell of onions at night, an odour everyone tolerated while believing it kept them civilised. The broader setting can't be overlooked. Cities were already saturated with smells of coal, smoke, animal waste, and stagnant water. Against this environment, the personal odour of breath was perhaps less noticeable. To mask it with herbs or onions seemed adequate. The pretense of freshness didn't need to be flawless, just sufficient to keep up appearances. In social situations, the long-term damage was concealed. Behind these practices, women lost teeth early, suffered from persistent infections, and bore pain in silence. Dentists were available but costly and often frightening. Tooth removal was the most frequent procedure, performed with rough instruments and little concern for patient comfort. Preventive treatment was almost unknown. Instead, the onion under the pillow remained the gentle, familiar choice, a peculiar solace in a world of decline. Even the richest homes followed these customs. Costly powders and perfumes could mask the worst odours, but the fundamental neglect persisted. The onion, humble and inexpensive, connected all social levels. Both wealthy and poor depended on it somehow, convinced that nature itself offered protection. The reality, though, was quite different. In the stillness of night, beds filled with the sharp aroma of onion and citrus. Women rested their heads nearby, breathing in what they thought was healing. The following morning, they chewed flowers, bark, or herbs, continuing the cycle once more. There was no real cleansing, only the endless shifting of smells from one type to another. What mattered wasn't health, but the appearance of attention. The pillow concealed an onion, the mouth chewed bark, and the cloth rubbed salt on the gums. The outcome was decay disguised as refinement. The most bizarre of all were the secret formulas that used something far more intimate than onions or herbs. Among the strangest Victorian beauty rituals was one that depended not on powders, perfumes, or plants, but on the body's own waste. In the privacy of morning, some women gathered their own urine and used it to cleanse their faces. They believed that the first urine of the day possessed special purifying qualities, capable of brightening the skin and preventing blemishes. To them, this wasn't revolting but sensible. It was handed down as an inherited formula, whispered within families, shared by mothers with daughters, and defended as a secret of sophistication. The practice wasn't limited to the poor or the hopeless. Even among the upper classes, the concept of urine as a cleanser held credibility. Aristocratic women discussed it as a household remedy, a private solution that required no merchant and cost nothing. It seems almost absurd that the same women who wore jewels and fine lace believed the liquid from their own bodies was the secret to beauty. Yet, they embraced it. Each morning, with delicate hands, they cleaned their faces with cloths moistened by urine, allowing the harsh smell to remain as the liquid absorbed into their skin. The belief was rooted in ideas of purity. Urine leaving the body clear and warm in the early hours was thought to carry away flaws. The skin treated daily was expected to look smoother and brighter. The truth was less elegant. The ammonia and chemicals in the liquid irritated the skin, causing redness and dryness. Women accepted this as part of the method, convincing themselves that stinging proved it was working. In fact, they were rubbing bodily waste into their pores. For those who followed it, discretion was crucial. It was seldom discussed outside the home. Servants occasionally discovered the practice, instructed to wash cloths that carried the odour, but they remained quiet. To reveal such habits risked scandal. The families involved continued as if nothing were strange, maintaining a refined appearance in public while clinging to these secret rituals in private. The silence helped the custom survive for decades. Morning routines differed, but urine was often followed by layers of powder and perfume. The smell that clung to the skin was masked by rosewater or heavy floral fragrances. By the time a woman entered society, no evidence of the ritual was meant to linger. Only those nearest to her might detect the faint odour beneath the perfume. Yet even if they did, they pretended not to notice. The laws of propriety demanded silence above everything. The use of urine in beauty routines wasn't exclusive to England. Throughout Europe, folk beliefs had long claimed its benefits as a cleanser. In Victorian times, these ancient ideas merged with the obsession for fair skin. Women searched for any technique to maintain their complexion smooth, and urine was cheap, available, and easily justified as natural. Compared to today, it would be like ignoring expensive beauty products and instead applying household waste to the face each morning, insisting it was the key to attractiveness. The ridiculousness is obvious to us, but wasn't to them. The continuation of this habit shows how tightly appearance controlled the culture. A woman might tolerate the smell, the irritation, and the secrecy because the reward was social acceptance. To be pale and clear-skinned was to be praised. To fall short of that ideal was to risk gossip and criticism. The extremes women reached, including rubbing their faces with urine, show the desperation connected to beauty in this era. The physical consequences worsened over time. Skin developed sores, peeled in sections, or showed constant redness. But rather than recognize these as signs of harm, women saw them as reasons to persist. More treatment seemed necessary, not less. The cycle continued daily, trapping them in a routine that harmed as much as it promised. I can't help but picture the discomfort of a woman smiling in a packed room, her skin burning slightly under powder, while knowing that the morning had started with the sting of urine on her face. Servants and working-class women also adopted the practice when they heard about it. For them, it held attraction. No expense, no stores, no need for scarce powders. Urine was the one resource always available. What started in whispers among the aristocracy spread downward, moving across classes as an accepted but hidden tradition. Silence preserved it, and shame kept it unspoken. This custom fit perfectly within the broader contradictions of Victorian cleanliness. The same society that constructed elaborate parlours and dressed in countless layers accepted habits that would now seem unthinkable. Beneath the polished surface, women applied waste to their faces and called it refinement. They believed the smell could be hidden, the truth buried, and the illusion sustained. The reality was left to fester behind the curtain of appearance. The morning urine ritual wasn't discussed openly, but its influence spread across households. It reveals more than just an odd tradition. It shows how the fear of imperfection and the desire for status could lead people to embrace what appears disgusting. It also shows how silence allowed the practice to continue, unquestioned and unacknowledged, concealed beneath perfume and powder, shielded by the rules of modesty. Faces were rubbed with what the body expelled. Perfume masked the smell but not the reality. The next hidden secret was even more agonizing, buried in the silence surrounding women's monthly experiences. In Victorian society, menstruation was among the most forbidden topics. Women endured it each month, yet few dared mention it openly. The thought of discussing bodily functions was considered disgraceful, unladylike, and inappropriate for decent conversation. Even within households, the subject was handled in hushed tones, if addressed at all. The silence was so complete that many young girls faced their first cycle without proper guidance, depending only on rushed explanations or improvised methods. What was biological was treated as taboo, and the burden of that silence fell completely on women. The approaches to managing menstruation were primitive and secretive. Most women used small strips of cotton fabric, folded and secured in place. These pieces were washed in separate containers, hidden from the sight of men or even other household women. After washing, they were dried in dark spaces or private areas where nobody would notice them. Sunlight and fresh air, which could have kept the fabric clean, were avoided due to embarrassment. Consequently, the cloth often remained moist, harbouring bacteria that easily caused infection. It's almost incredible that a society obsessed with morality forced women to handle their health in hidden corners, as if cleanliness itself were shameful. The dangers were apparent even then. Rashes, irritation, and serious infection affected women who had no safe method to manage their cycles. Doctors seldom discussed these problems, and when they did, they couched their advice in vague terms that avoided the reality of menstruation. The topic was deemed too improper to appear in medical journals or newspapers. Women endured quietly, viewing their pain as an unspoken obligation. Infections that could have been avoided with basic hygiene became chronic conditions. The responsibility fell heavily on household staff. When stains appeared on dresses, it was often the servant who noticed first. A spot on an outer garment could result in punishment, not understanding. Mistresses sometimes blamed their staff for missing such details, as if a maid should have anticipated the unavoidable. The stain itself was viewed as a moral failing rather than a biological reality. This cruelty shows how little comprehension or kindness surrounded the subject. Makeshift methods were widespread. Some women folded rags from worn clothing, while others used layers of linen tucked awkwardly into their garments. Because washing was so challenging, these rags were used repeatedly, often without adequate drying or cleaning. Infections of the reproductive system became common, yet nobody dared connect them to the hidden cloths. Compared to today, it would be like forcing half the population to reuse dirty tissues for weeks, while forbidding them to explain why. The cruelty existed not only in the shortage of resources, but in the imposed silence. The silence reached beyond the household. Stores didn't advertise or publicly sell products for women's cycles. To request such items in public would have been shocking. Therefore, women depended on private connections, sharing advice quietly, each generation inheriting the same restricted practices. What should have been a health matter remained a source of shame. The mental burden was as harmful as the physical. Women lived with the terror of being discovered. A single stain on a dress could cause humiliation. Even within families, men were rarely informed of the truth. Husbands might observe their wives' discomfort, but never discuss it. Daughters learned early to stay silent, to hide their struggles as evidence of virtue. I can't help but feel disturbed when I think of these women, forced to smile at social events while concealing pain that society refused to recognise. The cultural demand for silence created a pattern of ignorance. Without open conversation, women had little access to better options. Improvements in hygiene developed slowly because nobody would request them. Pain and infection were accepted as normal, even though they were avoidable. The insistence on silence didn't preserve women's honour. It deprived them of care, comfort, and advancement. In wealthier homes, the situation was no different. Even when means were available, the shame remained. Servants cleaned and concealed cloths carefully, ensuring that no evidence appeared before guests. Women of high status suffered the same infections as their poorer sisters, evidence that shame recognised no class divisions. The garments of both rich and poor carried the same risks, the same silence, and the same hidden agony. The gap between public morality and private truth was enormous. Victorian society celebrated itself on order and virtue, yet it compelled women to handle menstruation in the most unsanitary way possible. The silence protected the fantasy of respectability while harming the very women it was meant to honour. What could have been resolved with simple honesty became a lifelong burden wrapped in secrecy. Behind lace and silk, women reused damp cloths, suffered pain and feared exposure. Stains brought discipline, infections multiplied and silence persisted. They accepted this as womanhood because to rebel would mean breaking rules established by society itself. The consequence was generations of women who lived with suffering that couldn't even be spoken aloud. The cloths were concealed, the stains punished, and the pain dismissed. Beneath the silence, infections grew more severe, and the same silence surrounded how women tended to their hands and mouths with practices that brought their own hazards. Victorian daily existence appeared refined on the surface, but many of the customs that seemed like hygiene were far from sanitary. A notable example was the dependence on handkerchiefs instead of washing. For women in this time, carrying cloth wasn't simply about fashion or grace. It was their primary instrument for wiping, drying, and pretending that attention had been paid to the body. Hand washing with soap and water was uncommon, avoided for reasons of convenience, expense, and superstition. The consequence was that pieces of fabric folded neatly in a pocket or purse became replacements for genuine hygiene. They were pressed to the lips after eating, dabbed against perspiration on the brow, and even used for cleaning private parts. Once folded, they were stored away until the next use without being laundered between times. This behaviour was so typical that to Victorians it barely seemed strange. The handkerchief was often presented as a symbol of cultivation. Ladies displayed embroidered cloths with monograms or lace borders, drawing them out in company with an elegant gesture. The movement was praised as courteous and refined, but nobody remarked on the fact that the same cloth might have been used earlier that day for far less sophisticated purposes. Cleanliness was judged by looks rather than by reality. A tidily folded handkerchief suggested organisation, even if it was stiff with residue. It's almost comical that people persuaded themselves that a scented rag could bear the responsibility of personal hygiene, yet it was embraced across every level of society, from the rich to the poor. Perfume made this deception simpler to sustain. Bottles of potent floral essence were kept on vanity tables and in handbags. Women doused their handkerchiefs generously to cover the smells of repeated use. The cloths often held a thick mixture of rose water, lavender, and other oils layered over the underlying scent of perspiration, saliva, and waste. To others' noses, the perfume was overwhelming. To the women themselves, it was comfort that nobody would detect what lay underneath. The handkerchief became both a disguise and protection, creating the impression of care while hiding negligence. Multiple cloths were sometimes carried simultaneously. A lady of standing might carry 2 or 3 in her purse or tucked within her sleeves, rotating between them based on what the moment demanded. One served for her face, another for her lips, and perhaps a third for more personal needs. But rotation didn't mean replacement. Each one was used again and again for days, sometimes an entire week before anyone considered washing them. In households with less money, women often owned just 1 or 2, using them until they turned rigid with accumulated grime. Imagine today using the same tissue over and over for your face, hands, and body throughout an entire week. Yet somehow believing this demonstrated sophistication. The comparison shows just how ridiculous what Victorians considered normal really was. The health dangers were clear even back then, though people rarely talked about them. A moist fabric pressed over and over against the lips brought germs directly back to the skin. Materials used for private areas easily transmitted diseases without thorough cleaning. Bacteria thrived in the warm, perfumed cloth. Women suffered rashes, skin problems, and serious infections, but these were dismissed as natural female frailties. Few connected the dots to those handkerchiefs they displayed so elegantly. Physicians, trapped by cultural taboos, seldom discussed such practices openly. The topic of cleanliness itself was deemed improper for conversation. The household staff endured the worst of this routine. They gathered the fabrics for cleaning, dunking them in basins that quickly became disgusting. They scrubbed at marks with soap that reeked of animal grease, inhaling the combined stench of cologne and decay. Still, they had no option but to handle these items as precious belongings. Needlework and lace received careful treatment, even when filth covered them completely. What the servants knew about how these fabrics had been used was never discussed. Quiet compliance maintained the pretense of elegance. I find myself disturbed imagining a housemaid bent over a basin of reeking water. Washing a cloth her employer would wave around proudly the following day. The gap between how things looked and how they actually were was enormous. Carrying a handkerchief marked you as well-mannered, a sign of grace. Going without one meant you were vulgar or thoughtless. But the item itself was among the filthiest things a woman owned. Every day brought fresh contamination, and every evening ended with that same cloth folded away for tomorrow. Fragrance and fancy stitching transformed dirt into style. Even among the wealthy, the issue continued. Having more handkerchiefs didn't mean they got cleaned more frequently. It just meant there were more to cycle through. A drawer packed with scented fabric created an impression of plenty, but every piece was treated identically. The poor suffered worse with fewer options, but the custom crossed all social lines. The notion that cloth could substitute for water connected women everywhere. How long this practice lasted shows the broader Victorian approach to cleanliness. How things appeared counted far more than reality. Washing with soap and water was mistrusted, sometimes considered harmful, while carrying a handkerchief earned praise as proper behaviour. The society valued delicate gestures over genuine health measures. A woman received compliments for gently touching her lips in public, even as she used that same fabric on her body. Behind closed doors, the appearance of care mattered more than actual care. This dependence on handkerchiefs also demonstrates how social expectations overpowered common sense. A woman who abandoned the practice risked being viewed as odd or inappropriate. Everyone followed identical patterns because everyone feared being different. It was simpler to carry a perfumed cloth and participate in the shared fantasy than to break the silence and face criticism. Like many Victorian customs, social pressure kept the cycle going. The handkerchief story isn't just about fabric and fragrance. It's about how a society chose fantasy over reality. It's about people holding onto symbols of sophistication even when they spread sickness. It's about the silence that let these contradictions continue unchallenged until hygiene finally evolved in later years. But during the peak of Victorian culture, the handkerchief stayed essential, an accessory that concealed as much as it displayed. Fabrics were pressed against faces, mouths, and intimate areas before being folded neatly away. Perfume masked their odour, while embroidery hid their stains. They were celebrated as symbols of refinement, even while harbouring contamination. What followed in the daily routine was equally unsanitary, because even the soap meant to clean the body was itself a source of terrible smell and irritation. Victorian women existed in a world where everyday hygiene was influenced as much by superstition and tradition as by what products were available. The soap they used provides one of the clearest examples. The most widespread type was created from animal fat combined with ash, a rough and oily substance that gave off a powerful putrid odour. By today's standards, this would barely count as soap at all. It produced little lather, left a film on the skin, and filled rooms with a smell that many likened to burning flesh. For most families, this was the only affordable choice. Buying better soap required money, and even then the improvement was minimal. Women at every social level faced identical problems. Tolerate the stench or give up soap completely. Understanding how this soap was made explains why it was so awful. Animal fat was gathered from kitchens and butcher shops, boiled with ashes until it formed crude bars. The smell from this process stuck to the final product. Adding water only made the odour stronger. Washing with this soap didn't create any sense of cleanliness. Instead, it left behind the sharp memory of fire and rot. It's almost funny that a culture that valued refinement so highly accepted a soap that made people smell worse after using it. But with so few choices, women used it anyway, holding their breath and scrubbing fast. For many, the skin damage was worse than the smell. The harsh makeup of the soap stripped away natural skin oils, causing dryness and painful cracking. Delicate skin responded with burning, redness, and rashes. Some women tried it once or twice and swore never to use it again. They saw soap not as a beauty aid but as an attack they needed to protect themselves from. They gave it up entirely, switching to powders or starches that created the impression of cleanliness without the agony. This way, the very product designed to clean drove people toward alternatives that accomplished nothing. Those substitutes became the daily habits of many. Rice powder was favoured, dusted lightly across the face to create a smooth appearance. Scented powders replaced washing, leaving behind floral smells that covered sweat and oil. To observers, this seemed elegant. To those living it, it was survival. Using powder avoided the stink of soap and the harm it caused, but it also meant skin was never truly cleaned in any real sense. Dirt and germs accumulated under the fine white dust, blocking pores and encouraging infections. Compared to now, it would be like replacing a shower with a spray of deodorant and baby powder each day, then convincing yourself you were actually clean. The ridiculousness is obvious, but to Victorians it was routine. The rejection of soap went beyond personal choice. In polite circles, women sometimes justified their decision by claiming that frequent washing was unladylike. Scrubbing too often was viewed as crude, something servants did after heavy work. A lady was supposed to look clean without admitting to the physical effort of washing, so refusing soap could even be presented as an act of sophistication. Dirt was handled with perfumes, powders and fabrics rather than with water and harsh blocks of fat. The illusion stayed intact while the body underneath paid the price. The poor couldn't even pretend. For them, cheap soap was all that existed. Laundresses, maids and factory workers scrubbed with it daily, leaving their hands raw and red. They endured the burning because they had no alternative. Their jobs demanded constant contact with dirt and grease, and soap, however unpleasant, remained necessary. The cracks on their fingers, the redness on their faces, and the smell that stuck to their clothing revealed the true cost. The wealthy avoided soap by choice. The poor suffered through it for survival. Servants in rich homes also handled this soap constantly. They washed linens, scrubbed floors and cleaned dishes with it, all while breathing in the rotten smell. Their employers might have spared their own faces from the bars, but they benefited from the labour of those who didn't. The servants bore the discomfort while the ladies powdered their cheeks and sprayed perfume, pretending that elegance came without cost. I can't help thinking about this double standard, where the same households that turned their noses up at soap's smell insisted their servants use it endlessly on clothing, dishes and furniture. Medical guidance provided little help. Some doctors encouraged washing with soap, believing it prevented illness. Others warned against it, claiming the harshness could damage women's sensitive skin. Without clear direction, people created their own rules. The outcome was chaos. Some avoided soap completely, while others used it sparingly, treating it as a necessary evil rather than a daily essential. Hygiene became about appearances, influenced more by fashion than by health. This suspicion of soap shows how different Victorian standards were from today's. Now, soap is expected to smell pleasant, to soothe the skin, and to be used daily without question. In the 19th century, it was a burden endured reluctantly and avoided whenever possible. Women turned to powders, perfumes, and makeshift methods rather than face soap's smell and sting. The irony is unmistakable. By avoiding the discomfort, they also avoided real cleanliness. How stubbornly such habits persisted shows how powerfully culture can override practicality. Even when evidence of infection and irritation was clear, people stuck to traditions. Women protected their skin from burning soap by refusing to wash, then hid the results with powder. Society praised the pale, powdered face without questioning what was underneath. Health was traded for appearance, as it was in so many aspects of Victorian life. In homes throughout England, the same scene played out. A bar of foul-smelling soap sat unused on the shelf. A jar of powder sat nearby, used daily to dust away shine and odour. The soap, intended to represent cleanliness, became a symbol of something entirely different, a reminder of discomfort avoided whenever possible. It lingered in the background, a product to be endured only when absolutely required. Women lived contradictory lives. Each day they powdered their faces, sprayed perfume and carried handkerchiefs, all to hide the absence of real washing. Soap was there but unwanted, a product they owned but preferred not to touch. This strange balance defined Victorian hygiene. Ownership without use, appearance without substance. The soap bar sat waiting, its rancid smell filling the air, while life continued around it as if it weren't there. The putrid bars remained on shelves, ignored by women who chose powders instead. The smell of fat and ash drifted through homes but was covered with perfume, and the next household item that promised to clean was even more disgusting, because toothbrushes themselves carried mould, filth, and disease. Victorian hygiene went beyond the body to include the tools they used. Few objects show the contradictions of that time more clearly than the toothbrush. What seems to us like a basic cleaning instrument was, in their world, a crude, unsanitary piece of wood with rough bristles made from pig hair. These brushes were often badly made, shedding bristles into the mouth or scraping gums until they bled. They were used not with modern toothpaste, but with powders made from chalk, salt, or even crushed brick. Cleaning with such a tool was more about going through the motions than achieving actual hygiene. After each use, the brush was put away without being rinsed properly. The wet bristles quickly gathered residue from the mouth. Food bits, saliva, and chalk stuck together, forming clumps that hardened between the pig hairs. Left in dark and damp bedrooms, the brushes soon grew mould. Green and black spots appeared, spreading along the base of the bristles, but this was considered normal. To Victorians, it was simply how things were. It's almost ridiculous that something meant to clean the mouth became a breeding ground for decay. Sharing brushes was also common. A single brush might be passed among family members, sometimes between parents and children, sometimes even among guests in a household. The idea of personal hygiene didn't extend to personal tools. One brush served the entire family, stored in a shared dish or left on a shelf near the washstand. Disease spread easily, though few made the connection. Colds, mouth infections, and other illnesses travelled from person to person through the very tool meant to prevent them. Storage habits made the problem worse. Bathrooms, as we understand them, didn't exist in most homes, so toothbrushes were often kept in bedrooms. Chamber pots sat nearby, sometimes just inches from where brushes were placed. The air carried the smell of waste, and in some cases, brushes rested directly beside toilets or within reach of the pot. The combination of cleanliness and filth in such close proximity was remarkable. By modern standards, it would be like keeping a toothbrush next to a trash can and never washing it, then still thinking it represented good hygiene. Yet this was considered ordinary in Victorian homes. For those who used them, Brushing wasn't even a daily activity. Some brushed only before social events, relying on chewing herbs or rinsing with vinegar for regular days. The toothbrush was more a symbol of effort than a daily tool. Owning one suggested sophistication, even if it was covered in mould. In poorer families, few owned such tools at all. Cloth, salt, or bark served as substitutes, rubbed quickly across teeth to mask odour rather than to clean. Dentists of that era occasionally raised concerns about poor practices, but their advice rarely reached most people. Even when warnings appeared in newspapers, they were overwhelmed by tradition. Families stuck to their habits, unwilling to throw away brushes or to question practices handed down through generations. Mouldy bristles remained in use day after day, passed between mouths, accepted in silence. I can't help feeling disturbed imagining a family lined up in the morning, each taking the same brush in turn, pressing it into their mouths without a thought. Wealthier women sometimes tried to hide the problem with perfume. They sprayed the handles of their brushes or wiped them with scented cloths, convincing themselves that the smell of lavender or rose meant cleanliness. Of course, the bristles themselves remained untouched, still harbouring the same mould and residue. The gesture was about appearance, not effectiveness. This pattern repeated across many areas of Victorian hygiene, illusion valued over truth. Even when brushes wore down, they were rarely thrown away. Pig bristles loosened and fell out, leaving gaps that made cleaning even less effective. Still, the brush was kept, sometimes for years, until it completely fell apart. In families where money was tight, broken brushes were tied together or old bristles were pressed into new handles. The result was a tool that looked usable but carried years of accumulated filth. The contradiction between belief and reality defined this practice. Owning a toothbrush was supposed to suggest modernity and sophistication. Using it was supposed to show you were among the few who took hygiene seriously. But in reality, the tool carried more disease than it prevented. It was a mark of progress that actually pulled people backward. Morning routines across Victorian households repeated this cycle. A chalk powder, a pig bristle brush. A few quick strokes, then the brush was left to rot until the next use. Mould grew, bristles fell out, and diseases spread. But none of this was acknowledged. What mattered was that the action had been performed. Cleanliness was assumed, even when decay sat obviously on the tool itself. The toothbrushes sat in bedrooms near chamber pots. Damp and unwashed, they were shared between mouths, used until they broke apart, and covered in mould that nobody questioned. What surrounded them was no cleaner, because the very rooms that held these tools were thick with dust, fabric, and the smell of decay. Victorian households loved to present themselves as examples of sophistication, and nowhere was this more obvious than in the bedroom. Wealthy families spent fortunes on heavy curtains, thick carpets, elaborate bedding, and layers of fabric designed to display elegance and comfort. On the surface, these rooms looked magnificent, filled with velvet drapes and polished furniture. But beneath the appearance of luxury lay filth. The very materials chosen to show wealth were the ones that trapped dust, held moisture, and created perfect environments for mould and bacteria. These bedrooms, meant to represent status, became some of the dirtiest spaces in the house. The curtains were often made of velvet or other dense fabrics. Their weight gave them an impressive appearance, falling from high ceilings to the floor in thick folds. They darkened the rooms, filtering sunlight and creating an atmosphere of privacy and calm. Yet those folds collected dust day after day, rarely if ever cleaned. Each time the fabric moved, small clouds of fine particles drifted into the air. Without regular washing, the curtains became reservoirs of dirt. It's almost absurd that families spent large amounts on velvet drapes only to let them slowly rot, with dust and insects hidden inside. But the appearance of wealth mattered more than the reality of hygiene. The The beds were equally problematic. Feather mattresses were valued for their softness. Filled with layers of down or feathers packed tightly together, they seemed luxurious, offering a deep surface to sink into after a long day. Yet these mattresses were rarely aired or washed. Feathers absorbed sweat and moisture, and over time they smelled strongly of decay. Bedbugs thrived inside them, feeding at night while women slept under thick blankets. The problem was well known but often ignored. Replacing a mattress was expensive, and being infested was considered shameful. So families endured, convinced that the appearance of a fine bed outweighed the discomfort it caused. Carpets made things worse. Victorian floors were often covered in thick rugs or wall-to-wall carpeting, designed to reduce drafts and add warmth. But these heavy fabrics trapped dirt brought in from outside. Coal dust from fireplaces, ash from candles, and mud from shoes collected in the fibres. Cleaning them required enormous effort. Vacuum cleaners didn't exist, and even sweeping only stirred the dirt higher into the air. As a result, carpets were washed infrequently, sometimes only once a year. By then, they carried years of accumulated filth, giving the rooms a constant musty smell. Compared to today, it would be like carpeting a room and never cleaning it for years, then acting surprised when the air became heavy with dust. Windows also contributed to the filth. Many households believed that fresh air was dangerous, carrying disease-causing vapours. Because of this superstition, windows were kept closed most of the time. Curtains remained drawn, keeping out both light and airflow. Without circulation, moisture from breathing, washing, and even sweating lingered in the room. The result was damp walls, mould creeping into corners, and an ever-present smell of mildew. This wasn't hidden. Anyone stepping into such a bedroom would have noticed the odour immediately. But the belief in harmful outdoor air was stronger than the discomfort inside. Every step taken in these rooms stirred the filth further. The fine dust that collected on carpets and curtains lifted easily into the air when disturbed. Each footfall became a small cloud of particles to be breathed in. With every breath, people grew accustomed to coughing, to waking with clogged noses, and to feeling heaviness in their lungs. They explained these symptoms as ordinary weakness, never connecting them to the very rooms they slept in. Science wasn't advanced enough to show them the dangers of poor ventilation and constant dust. Comfort, or at least the illusion of it, outweighed all evidence. Furniture and decorations added even more layers of filth. Upholstered chairs, cushions and blankets filled bedrooms with texture and colour, but they were almost never cleaned properly. Fabric trapped dirt, sweat and body oils. Over time, the smell of human presence grew stronger, masked only by perfume and occasional sprinklings of herbs. Cabinets and dressers collected dust, along with moths, which chewed quietly at clothing stored inside. The more elaborate the room appeared, the more surfaces there were to trap filth. I can't help imagining standing in such a room, the air thick with dust and perfume, the curtains heavy with grime, yet being told this was the height of elegance. The silence around these conditions was striking. Just as women were forbidden to discuss menstruation or body odour, few spoke openly of mould or bedbugs. To complain risked insulting the household. Guests stayed quiet, servants kept their observations to themselves, and families pretended their rooms were spotless. The illusion of sophistication was preserved at all costs, even when health suffered. Appearances were defended fiercely. Servants, as always, carried the heaviest burden. They beat carpets outdoors when ordered, choking on clouds of dust. They shook blankets and tried to scrub curtains, though true cleaning was impossible. Their own lungs filled with the residue of coal, mould and fabric fibres, yet they were expected to present the rooms as perfect. Candles were lit, perfumes were sprayed, and visitors were impressed, never knowing what they were breathing in. For the servants, the glamorous rooms of their employers were workplaces of constant discomfort. doctors began to notice the effects. Respiratory illnesses were common in cities, and while pollution from factories and coal played a role, the homes themselves contributed. Asthma, chronic coughs, and tuberculosis spread quickly in environments with little air circulation and high levels of dust. Sleeping chambers transformed into incubators of illness rather than havens of rest. Yet deep-rooted beliefs about night air made changing these habits nearly impossible. Families continued sealing themselves within rooms teeming with germs and fungus, convinced they were protecting themselves from outdoor dangers. This wasn't just a problem of the affluent middle class. Even struggling families copied these decorating trends. Cheaper materials and knockoff rugs were purchased, but they accumulated grime just the same, with fewer means to maintain them. In modest households, conditions were frequently worse. Living spaces became cramped containers of filth and stench, supposed retreats that secretly damaged well-being. The urge to look sophisticated trumped actual comfort across every social level. When darkness fell, the effects intensified. Drapes blocked fresh air completely. Down-filled beds retained body heat, while rugs released accumulated dust from the day. People rested in their beds, inhaling humid, stagnant air, believing they were protected. Morning brought hacking coughs, scratchy throats, and stuffed sinuses. Yet these were dismissed as typical seasonal ailments. Seldom did anyone blame the rooms themselves. Sleeping quarters were supposed to represent luxury and status, so their unhealthy nature went unquestioned. The opulent bedroom wasn't a refuge, but a prison. Drapery, floor coverings, and linens created sophistication that concealed contamination. Air became thick, fungus took hold, and germs multiplied. Nightly, people rested in what we now understand as unsanitary environments, accepting it as appropriate. Image triumphed over substance once more. Well-being took second place, allowing these customs to persist for generations. Window treatments decayed with grime, beds crawled with bugs, and floor coverings retained years of accumulated odours. Walking stirred up clouds of contamination, while fresh air never entered. The facade of refinement persisted, masking underlying rot. While these rooms endangered health, another area of the body suffered equally. Hidden beneath multiple clothing layers were the feet of Victorian ladies. Among all the overlooked aspects of Victorian cleanliness, women's feet were particularly abandoned. Floor-length gowns hid them entirely, while multiple stockings and boots kept them invisible. Being concealed meant being forgotten. Feet transported women through crowded, dirty streets of industrial towns, yet they were seldom cleaned, rarely examined, and never mentioned in respectable conversation. Consequently, underneath fashionable dresses and polished footwear, Victorian women's feet became among the filthiest parts of their anatomy. Hosiery was typically wool or heavy cotton. These materials absorbed perspiration and held dampness against flesh all day long. Footwear was constructed from rigid leather, frequently too narrow and rarely allowed air circulation. Extended periods, walking or standing, meant feet stayed perpetually moist, squeezed, and oxygen-starved. Taking off shoes at evening released odours many ignored but couldn't dispute. It's almost contradictory that ladies could dedicate hours grooming their hair and faces with cosmetics and fragrances, while their feet deteriorated quietly in darkness. Daily cleaning challenges worsened the situation. Dresses were unwieldy, with numerous layers making bending or squatting uncomfortable. Getting to feet for proper washing proved challenging, particularly for corseted women. Many simply avoided the effort. Water itself was viewed suspiciously, and soap was unpleasant. Feet stayed wrapped in hosiery day after day, collecting grime and moisture. Some ladies might briefly splash water over them occasionally, but regular washing wasn't standard practice. This neglect was evident in the toenails. Without proper care or trimming, nails grew lengthy, rough, and blackened with dirt. Yet this caused no shame. Since feet remained hidden, their state was irrelevant. Society evaluated women based on facial cleanliness, dress brightness, and behavioral refinement. Feet were exempt from this assessment, left to deteriorate. Comparing to today, it would be like polishing jewelry daily while never cleaning teeth, believing invisible things didn't matter. Infections were unavoidable. Fungus flourished in the moist environment of stockings and shoes. Blisters developed from constant friction, and cuts frequently became infected from accumulated filth on skin. Unwashed foot odour permeated bedrooms and sitting rooms despite perfume attempts to mask it. Servants noticed most clearly when undressing their mistresses each evening. They removed stockings soaked with sweat, shoes lined with dirt, and nails thick with grime. They maintained and repaired footwear while the root problem remained unspoken. Foot care also varied by social class. Wealthy women sometimes owned multiple pairs of shoes and stockings, allowing rotation between them. Even so, foot washing remained uncommon. For poorer women, conditions were worse. With just 1 or 2 pairs of stockings, they wore identical damp fabric repeatedly until it nearly disintegrated. Boots were rarely replaced, their interiors becoming permanent sources of smell and disease. The poor suffered discomfort openly, while the wealthy masked it with fabric layers and fragrances. The silence around women's feet reflected broader cultural denial. Just as monthly cycles were never discussed, neither were foot hygiene realities. Mentioning the topic would have seemed crude. Instead, it was ignored, despite nearly everyone experiencing identical problems. Guests might detect odours in parlours or during lengthy carriage trips, but never acknowledged them. Refinement's illusion was maintained through silence. I can't help picturing the contrast of a ballroom filled with perfume and silk, while beneath every dress were damp stockings and filth-covered feet. Medical literature rarely addressed foot hygiene then. Physicians might treat serious infections, but preventive care was almost never mentioned. Cultural beliefs that feet were unimportant reinforced this neglect. Women accepted pain, swelling, and infection as normal life aspects. Only when conditions became unbearable did they seek help, often too late to prevent lasting harm. The contradiction is obvious. The body part most exposed to dirty city streets was the least maintained. Shoes collected mud, horse waste, and industrial debris, which leaked through cracks into hosiery. Feet absorbed this contamination daily, but women lacked proper cleaning habits to remove it. Instead, they brought it into homes, beds, and daily routines, concealed under fabric layers. Ultimately, neglecting women's feet reflected Victorian values. Visible parts were polished, perfumed, and powdered until they sparkled. Hidden parts were completely ignored, regardless of their condition. Bodies were separated into important and unimportant sections. Feet belonged to the latter group, and their state revealed that appearance mattered far more than health. Feet stayed moist in stockings, nails grew black with dirt, and infections spread silently. Society overlooked them. Women tolerated them, and servants handled them quietly. While feet suffered in darkness, the rest of the body wasn't much cleaner, as many women believed fragrance alone could substitute proper washing. Victorian ladies lived where appearance was paramount, nowhere more evident than in their body care approach. Rather than washing with water and soap, many relied on perfume as their primary cleaning method. Bottles of strong scent sat ready on vanity tables, not just for dabbing behind ears, but for wiping down body parts. The perfume often contained high alcohol levels, causing sharp skin stinging. Yet, for many women, this pain was preferable to facing soap made from animal fat or bathing in convenience. To them, perfume wiping was sufficient. The technique was straightforward. Cloth or handkerchiefs were soaked in perfume, then pressed against underarms, necks, or groins. Alcohol evaporated quickly, leaving powerful floral or musky scents behind. Sweat odor was masked, and the woman seemed clean to others. The ritual created refinement impressions, though no actual dirt was removed. It's almost absurd that entire households accepted burning alcohol and perfume as bathing substitutes, but in Victorian times this was common, even admired. Side effects were harsh. Skin treated this way became raw, red, and inflamed. Continuous perfume wiping caused rashes, peeling, and sometimes blisters. Women bore the discomfort silently, convinced suffering was beauty's price. Powder could be applied over damaged areas, hiding irritation. The more skin burned, the more perfume was applied to mask odor. A cycle developed where harm was mistaken for sophistication. Perfume also became a clothing management tool. Heavy gowns absorbed sweat and odors, and without regular washing, they quickly became unpleasant. Women sprayed perfume directly onto fabric, especially around collars and underarms. The result was an overpowering mixture of sweat, alcohol, and floral oils. To Victorians, this marked elegance. To us, it seems more like announcing decay. Compared to today, it would be like skipping showers entirely and simply spraying deodorant on identical clothes for weeks while calling it hygiene. The comparison shows how appearances replaced reality in daily life. Servants endured this practice's burden. They prepared and refilled perfume bottles, laundered clothes reeking of alcohol and sweat, and watched mistresses wince from irritation while continuing the habit. They handled cloth stained with perfume and body oils, soaking them in water that quickly turned murky. Yet they stayed silent, because commenting would mean questioning their mistress's sophistication. The culture of silence again protected habits that harmed more than helped. Perfume was also used more intimately. Some women wiped between their legs with perfumed cloths, hoping to mask natural odours. The alcohol stung terribly, causing swelling and pain. But cleanliness illusions mattered more. Others dabbed perfume across chests, even on broken or irritated skin, despite obvious damage caused. I can't help imagining the discomfort of standing in crowded ballrooms, smiling through raw skin's sting covered in perfume, while pretending to be the picture of grace. This practice crossed class boundaries. Wealthier women accessed expensive perfumes with complex floral notes, while poorer women used cheaper, harsher scents. But effects were identical. Strong odours meant to mask bathing absence. The poor often stretched bottles by diluting them, producing weaker versions that still irritated skin. The wealthy drowned themselves in fashionable scents, leaving rooms heavy with perfume. Both groups shared identical contradictions, masking filth rather than removing it. Doctors occasionally warned against overusing alcohol-based perfumes, noting skin damage they caused. But these warnings were lost in a society where propriety mattered more than health. A pale face powdered white, a gown smelling of roses, and a composed smile were all that counted. Burns beneath perfume, infections hidden by powder, were ignored. Hygiene was measured not by cleanliness, but by appearances. The habit also reflected Victorian water fears. Many still believed bathing too frequently weakened bodies, or exposed them to illness. Perfume seemed safer, even superior. It required little effort, left strong impressions, and avoided risks people associated with water. In reality, it created new risks, replacing dirt with chemicals that slowly harmed skin. Yet cultural preference for illusion kept bottles in constant use. Bedrooms and parlours smelled thickly of perfume heavy enough to overwhelm visitors. Behind that scent lay sweat-soaked gowns, irritated skin, and cloth stained from repeated wiping. The contradiction was obvious, but never discussed. Silence preserved illusions, just as with many other Victorian hygiene aspects. Perfume was wiped across bodies, sprayed on clothes, and trusted to replace water and soap. Skin burned, fabric reeked, and discomfort was hidden beneath scent layers. Some women went even further, pouring perfume directly onto intimate areas, attempting to mask odour, with consequences even more damaging than raw skin. Behind gowns and jewellery elegance, some of the most desperate hygiene habits occurred privately. Strong perfume, already used to wipe necks, underarms and chests, was also poured onto cloths and applied between legs. The belief was simple. If perfume could mask sweat elsewhere, it could do the same in more hidden places. The reality, however, was painful and dangerous. Perfume alcohol stung sharply, leaving redness, swelling, and burning that lasted long after the ritual. Yet women continued, convinced sharp pain meant it was working. It's almost absurd that what was meant to make them appear refined in society involved pouring chemicals onto their body's most sensitive parts. Perfume wasn't the only liquid used. Some women turned to spirits like gin or brandy, rubbing them into skin as if they were cleansers. These drinks were already strong enough to burn throats when swallowed. On exposed flesh, effects were severe, but desperation outweighed discomfort. Odour was feared as an uncleanliness sign, and women preferred pain over risking judgment. Cultural silence around health meant no one admitted how much damage this caused. Infection spread quietly while society praised elegance and self-control. The practice left marks, both physical and hidden. Skin became raw, sometimes covered in sores, but these were rarely shown to anyone. Women endured silently, applying more powder and perfume on top of damage. For many, burning sensations were treated as proof the method succeeded, even though it only worsened conditions. Compared to today, it would be like taking industrial floor cleaner and applying it to bodies, then insisting pain was a cleanliness sign. The contrast shows how powerful refinement illusions were, strong enough to override common sense. Doctors occasionally encountered results. Women visited secretly, suffering from infections that had spread after repeated alcohol or perfume use. But even then, conversations were discreet. Openly admitting perfume had been poured into such places was unthinkable. Physicians treated symptoms while maintaining silence. No warnings were published, no campaigns began. The practice survived in shadows, shielded by shame and reinforced by society's appearance obsession. Servants sometimes witnessed aftermath. They laundered stained cloths, smelling of alcohol and perfume, realizing what they'd been used for. They prepared scent bottles for mistresses, knowing some would never be sprayed on gowns but used secretly instead. Yet, as always, they said nothing. Silence culture extended from highest ladies to lowest maids, binding everyone into identical complicity. I can't help imagining those women's discomfort, forced to smile at dinners while carrying infections from habits they dared not name. This ritual wasn't limited to particular classes. Wealthy women accessed finer perfumes and expensive spirits, while poorer women relied on cheaper colognes or diluted liquor. But methods were identical. Pain, followed by silence, followed by more perfume. Across drawing rooms and slums alike, women endured identical hidden suffering. The contradiction with Victorian moral ideals was striking. A society that constantly lectured about purity and modesty tolerated health-destroying habits in silence. Appearing clean mattered more than being clean. Women risked infections, fevers, and long-term illness rather than face possible odour. Bodies became secondary to refinement illusions. In private chambers, bottles stood ready. Cloths dipped in perfume or gin. Quick wipes and rituals were complete. Alcohol smells lingered briefly before being covered with more powder or floral scents. To the outside world, women appeared composed and graceful. Beneath surfaces, their skin burned and health deteriorated. Pain was carried silently, dismissed as private matters, never to be discussed. Habits endured because they fit perfectly into wider silence cultures. Just as menstruation, body odour and bedroom filth were never spoken of, neither were these private rituals. Women lived with discomfort as if it were duty. To refuse would risk shame. To speak would break propriety rules. So they endured and cycles continued across generations. Perfume was poured where no scent should be. Spirits burned skin in refinement's name. Endings were often identical: quiet doctor visits, secret treatments, and returns to silence. Behind closed doors, what society called elegance was leaving women scarred and sick. Perfumed cloths left burns, spirits deepened infections, and silence ensured nothing changed. Beneath gowns and jewellery was hidden damage. While bodies suffered secretly, another neglect layer revealed itself in how clothes were washed so rarely that filth became part of daily life. Clothing defined Victorian women's appearance more than almost anything else. Fabric layers, bright trims, and heavy skirts all worked together, creating elegance and respectability images. But beneath polished surfaces lay truths most households preferred ignoring. These dresses were rarely cleaned. For many women, washing entire gowns happened no more than monthly. Between rare washings, identical garments were worn repeatedly, layered with underclothes, and sprayed with perfume until too dirty to ignore. What appeared to be refined images were, in reality, compromises with filth. Problems began with dress nature itself. Victorian gowns weren't light or simple. They were made with thick fabrics like wool, silk and cotton, layered together into skirts that could weigh several pounds. Washing such garments wasn't a matter of tossing them into water. It required hours of labour. Servants had to haul buckets, heat water, scrub by hand, and hang gowns to dry, often taking entire days or more. Once wet, fabric was even heavier, and drying fully could take several days. Because of this, women preferred avoiding gown washing whenever possible. Instead of cleaning, they turned to concealment. Dirt spots on skirts were covered with ribbons, lace, or small decorative flowers pinned over fabric. Bodice stains were disguised with scarves or sashes. The idea wasn't removing filth, but hiding it from sight. As long as gowns looked acceptable from distances, no one dared ask about their close-up condition. It's almost laughable that women spent so much energy pinning decorations onto filthy fabric instead of simply washing it. Yet the practice was considered practical and even clever for daily life. Many women wore identical dresses again and again. They rotated between 2 or 3 gowns if fortunate, but each was treated identically. Instead of water and soap, quick fixes were used. Servants sometimes took crumpled paper or cloth scraps to dab at oily marks, blotting them away without truly removing them. This dry cleaning method was thought to freshen fabric without risking water damage. In truth, it only spread dirt more thinly, leaving gowns still soiled. Perfume was also pressed into service. Strong scents were sprayed directly onto fabric to cover sweat and mildew odours. Results were overwhelming mixtures of roses, lavender and decay clinging to every cloth layer. Visitors might notice perfume strength but never spoke of it openly. Cleanliness illusions remained intact, protected by silence. Compared to modern standards, it would be like wearing identical shirts every day for months, masking odours with deodorant and insisting they were still fresh. Absurdity becomes clear only when that time's silence is broken. Caring for these dresses' labour fell mostly on servants. Laundresses and maids worked tirelessly, maintaining garments rarely washed but constantly worn. When time finally came for full cleaning, tasks were immense. Heating water, scrubbing heavy skirts, rinsing and drying them consumed entire days. Servants strained backs lifting wet fabric, and hands burned from soap and hot water. Yet their work was invisible. Mistresses displayed gowns publicly as if effortlessly elegant, while costs in sweat and pain were hidden behind household walls. I can't help thinking of servants' sheer exhaustion spending days scrubbing dresses their mistresses had allowed to rot with dirt for weeks. Health consequences were significant. Dresses worn day after day collected sweat, dust and bacteria. Layers close to skin absorbed oils and body odours, then pressed them tightly against flesh. Rashes and infections became common, especially in folds where fabric rubbed constantly. Women endured itching, burning, and sores, but rarely connected these problems to their clothing. Doctors sometimes advised more frequent washing, but their words carried little weight against appearance and convenience cultures. Class didn't change these habits. Wealthier women owned more dresses, but gowns were equally heavy and difficult to wash. Instead of laundering, they rotated through larger wardrobes, allowing each gown to rest while still unwashed. Poorer women with only a few gowns wore identical ones until nearly falling apart. In both cases, results were identical: filth hidden beneath decoration. Differences were only in how many gowns were available to disguise it. Superstition against frequent washing also played roles. Many believed too much water contact weakened fabric, causing colours to fade or materials to wear out. As results, even families who could afford more frequent laundering avoided it. Clothing preservation mattered more than body cleanliness. Losing fine gowns to water damage was considered greater disasters than wearing filthy ones publicly. Social gatherings made contradictions more visible. Ballrooms filled with women in brightly decorated gowns, each appearing fresh and grand. Yet beneath candlelight, smells of sweat, perfume, and mildew lingered. Visitors could see it, but nobody spoke up. Speaking out would have been rude, breaking the quiet agreement that kept society's fantasies alive. Everyone went along with the charade, acting as if sophistication remained pure despite the grime stuck to the very materials that represented it. This dependence on ornaments and fragrance instead of actual cleaning reveals again how deeply image controlled Victorian society. Dresses weren't designed to be spotless, they were designed to be believable. Lace concealed stains, bows masked grime, and cologne covered up stench. Ladies walked through high society draped in layers of dirt that appeared lovely from afar. The flesh underneath paid the price. The maids who did the cleaning paid the price. Yet the fantasy of sophistication stayed alive. Week after week, dresses got worn, patched up with decorations, blotted with tissue, and doused with cologne. Only when the filth became impossible to hide did a complete washing happen, eating up days of work and making the dress thick and rigid. By that point, infections had already taken hold, smells had already set in, and the whole thing started over. Dresses became heavier with grime, maids worked their fingers to the bone, and ladies put up with rashes without complaint. The fantasy of sophistication remained untouched, even as physical health got worse. While the gowns showed one kind of neglect, the very baths supposed to cleanse the body brought no comfort, because they too were loaded with filth, bugs, and sickness. Taking a bath in Victorian times wasn't just about turning a handle and stepping into fresh water. For most households, even the well-off ones, a bath was treated as a special treat rather than something you did every day. Bathrooms, like we have now, didn't exist in most houses, and pipes were scarce or missing completely. Instead, families depended on movable tubs, bulky wooden or metal containers that got filled by hand with warmed water. This job took hours of labour from servants who had to haul bucket after bucket from the kitchen or backyard, warm the water over flames and dump it in the tub. When the bath was finally ready, the water was already getting cold, and all that effort meant the whole thing happened rarely. Most folks bathed only now and then, maybe just once weekly, and in less wealthy homes, even less than that. The tubs themselves were nothing like the shining ceramic we picture today. They were usually made of tin, copper or wood with metal lining, and they collected dirt fast. Without drains, water had to be ladled out by hand when the bath was done. Draining was just as much work as filling, so families made each bath last as long as they could. This meant the same water got used by multiple people in one house. The man of the house might go first, then the woman, then the kids, from oldest to youngest. When the final child got in the tub, the water was tepid, murky and full of debris. It's almost ridiculous that something meant for getting clean ended with the youngest family members soaking in everyone else's dirt. What floated on top revealed the truth. Soap foam built up fast, creating greasy films. Body hair, dead skin and regular dirt clumped together in masses. Soot from coal fires, brought in on clothes and hair, mixed in too. Often, insects were also there. Water brought to the tub wasn't always pure to start with. Frequently taken from wells or tanks where beetles, flies or maggots flourished. When the bath was set up, a thin ring of floating bugs often circled the water. Families put up with this as normal, brushing them away before getting in. Compared to now, it would be like filling a bathtub with water scooped from a street puddle, sharing it with everyone in the family and calling it a luxury. For servants, the bath was both backbreaking and degrading. They did all the heavy lifting to get the water ready, but seldom got to use the bath themselves. Their own cleanliness was handled with quick rinses from bowls or pails, if at all, while their bosses soaked in what they thought was elegance. Servants scrubbed their ladies' leftover grime from the tub, often while getting mocked for smelling like work. The gap between social classes got reinforced even in bathing, with the poor managing water they were never permitted to use. I can't help but notice the contradiction. The people who worked hardest to set up the bath were the ones refused the very luxury they created. Even for the rich, bathing wasn't daily. Fancy bathrooms with marble tubs and plumbing only existed in the biggest mansions. For everybody else, the portable tub stayed standard. Bathing once a week was thought to be plenty, and in many circles, too much bathing was actually discouraged. Doctors sometimes cautioned that washing too often could make the body weak, remove natural oils, or leave the system open to cold air. These beliefs strengthened the notion that perfume and powder could take the place of water. The water itself was frequently dangerous. In cities like London, water sources were badly contaminated with sewage. Even when heated for baths, pollutants stayed put. Families soaking in such water put themselves at risk for skin and eye infections. Complaints about rashes, wounds and itching were widespread, though few linked them straight to the baths. The connection between bathing and cleanliness was powerful enough to ignore the clear proof. The stench of a bath stuck around long after it was over. Steam rose from the water, carrying the smell of perspiration, soap and rot into the air. In tight homes, the moisture stuck to walls, promoting mould growth. Bathrooms, when they existed, were among the most poorly ventilated spaces in the house. The mix of still water, wet fabrics and bad airflow made them perfect spots for bacteria to multiply. Still, these rooms got shown off as signs of class. When company visited, the illusion of cleanliness mattered more than the reality of discomfort. In poorer homes, the situation was bleaker. Many didn't have tubs at all, depending instead on a bowl and a cloth for washing. Families packed into tiny rooms, taking turns wiping down with water that got changed only sometimes. Shared bowls meant shared germs, but it was accepted as the only choice. Baths, when they happened, were viewed as special events, prepared for holidays or when guests came by. For regular life, dirt was handled with perfume powders or just overlooked. Kids suffered the most from these ways. Being the last to get in the reused bath water, they soaked in the dirtiest conditions. Diseases moved quickly through families, with skin infections and sickness often traced back to bad hygiene. But without medical understanding to show the link, families saw these troubles as just part of living. Deaths from infection or illness were accepted as natural destiny rather than something that could be prevented. The presence of bugs in bath water was more than just symbolic. It showed the lack of separation between daily existence and dirt. Water pulled from outdoor sources carried whatever lived in it. Families knew this, but had no other option. To them, insects were just another hassle, swept aside without mention. Clean water was too scarce and too costly to waste on comfort. A bath, even one full of filth, was still thought better than nothing. The contradiction was obvious. Bathing was celebrated as a mark of class, while being done in ways that spread disease. Families soaked in water that got nastier with each person, surrounded by dirt they chose to ignore. To the outside world, a bath meant progress. To those living it, it was often awkward, unpleasant, and unsanitary. The heavy tubs, the reused water, and the bugs floating on top turned the supposed luxury of bathing into a danger to health. Still, the practice continued, backed by tradition and silence. People put up with the discomfort, convinced they were taking part in refinement, even as their bodies took in more dirt than they got rid of. Tubs sat in bedrooms and kitchens filled with grey water. Servants hauled bucket after bucket. Families shared the same bath and insects floated silently on the surface. What was called cleanliness was really little more than ceremony, and when the bath was drained, women turned to other ways of controlling smell, dusting themselves with powders made of ash or herbs, hoping these would work where water had failed. Among the many ways Victorian women tried to manage their bodies without real washing, one of the most remarkable was using makeshift deodorants. Rather than soaps or powders made to eliminate smell, women turned to household supplies like ash from fireplaces or dried bay leaves. These materials were not only inexpensive, but also easy to get, making them practical when bathing was uncommon and perfume was expensive. The concept was straightforward. Ash soaked up moisture, while leaves gave off a weak scent. But the outcome was far from clean. Ash was the most popular pick. Women sprinkled it in shoes to cut down on sweat and smell, or dusted it inside corsets and underclothes. Ash worked to absorb, drawing up moisture from skin squeezed tight against clothing layers. But ash also stuck stubbornly to fabric, leaving grey stains that rubbed against the skin. It irritated open pores, creating rashes and tiny sores. Still, the practice happened every day. It's almost ridiculous that something scraped right from the bottom of a fireplace was treated as a tool of elegance. Bay leaves were used in a different way. Dried leaves were stitched into little pouches or tucked into clothing pockets. Women slipped them into the space between their breasts. Hidden under corsets and tops, the leaves let out a mild fragrance, covering the smell with a faint plant scent. But stuffed into fabric layers already soaked with sweat, the effect quickly went bad. Within hours, the fragrance mixed with moisture, making a stale smell instead of hiding it. Yet the routine went on. Since appearance mattered more than comfort, shoes became one of the filthiest places for these experiments. Stockings trapped sweat, while leather boots let in little air to handle the smell. Ash was poured straight in. Over time, the ash mixed with sweat into a thick paste that covered the soles and sides of the shoes. Taking off boots at day's end let out a stench that no amount of perfume could hide. Servants who had to clean and care for footwear got the worst of it, scraping out the paste of ash and sweat before polishing the boots for reuse. Compared to today, it would be like sprinkling fireplace ash into sneakers, wearing them all day and insisting this counted as deodorant. For many households, these methods were the only affordable choices. Perfume cost too much, and soap hurt the skin, so women turned to what they already owned. Ash cost nothing. Bay leaves could be grown in gardens or bought cheap at markets. These habits moved from one generation to the next, talked about as smart advice rather than desperation. The dangers of infection and skin irritation were overlooked, overshadowed by the fear of seeming unclean. Servants once again were central. They gathered ash from fireplaces, sifted it, and got it ready for their mistress to use. They stitched pouches of bay leaves, replacing them as they rotted into wet, dark pieces. They washed clothes marked by grey streaks and carried the smell of ash and sweat on their hands. Their work made it possible for women to keep up the illusion of elegance, even while hiding practices that were far from clean. I can't help but think how disturbing it must have been to handle clothes stuffed with damp leaves or covered in ash, all while pretending they were signs of sophistication. The silence around these habits was powerful. Just as periods, foot smell and other private matters were never openly talked about, using ash and leaves was kept secret. Women carried pouches and sprinkled ash quietly, never admitting to the discomfort. Guests might smell the staleness when sitting close, but good manners prevented comment. This way, the illusion of refinement stayed intact, even as the reality of filth got worse over time. The ash absorbed not only sweat, but also the smell of the body itself. Damp ash turned sour, sticking to fabric and flesh together. What started as a deodorant became a source of smell on its own. The bay leaves, too, quickly lost their fragrance, replaced by the stench of rot. But since these methods were accepted as normal, nobody questioned them. To suggest otherwise would have meant challenging the traditions that ruled daily life. In the end, these practices showed again the Victorian fixation with appearance. Ash and bay leaves didn't remove dirt or stop smell. They only hid the problem, briefly, making new ones along the way. But since they fit the culture of silence and illusion, they lasted. Women suffered rashes, servants endured filth, and society acted like refinement was intact. Ash filled shoes, leaves filled corsets, and the air filled with a musty smell that everyone ignored. Women put up with the discomfort quietly, convinced that these rituals were proper. But the very powders they trusted for freshness brought dangers of their own, because even the scented cosmetics they breathed in each day slowly poisoned their lungs. Among the many habits Victorian women adopted to look elegant, one of the most damaging involved the powders they used on their faces and bodies. These powders were not the carefully tested cosmetics of today. Instead, they were made by crushing materials like clay, chalk, and even plaster of Paris into fine dust. Fragrance was added, often from dried flowers or chemical oils, to make the powder seem fancy. Women spread it across their faces, necks and arms each morning, believing it kept their skin pale, smooth and refined. What they didn't realise was that every breath they took carried those same particles into their lungs. Day after day, the ritual of beauty became a slow assault on their own health. The act of putting on powder looked graceful in mirrors. A cloud of dust rose as a brush swept across the skin. The faint smell of lavender or rose hung in the air, but the elegance hid danger. The fine grains drifted into noses and throats, settling deep in the lungs. With each breath, more powder entered the body, irritating delicate tissues that had no way to get rid of it. It's almost absurd that women were praised for beauty while quietly suffocating on the very powders that created it. At first, the effects were minor. A continuing cough, a rough throat, and a slight trouble breathing in stuffy rooms. But as months turned into years, the damage got worse. Women developed ongoing irritation, waking in the morning to cough up phlegm streaked with powder. Some suffered throat swelling that made eating painful. In serious cases, the lungs became damaged, leading to illnesses that doctors called consumption, but we now know included tuberculosis. Still, the powders were used every day. To quit would mean showing greasy or uneven skin in public, something no woman of class was willing to risk. What the powders were made of made things worse. Clay and chalk were common, but so was gypsum, better known as plaster. These minerals were harsh scrubbers, scratching the skin's surface while harming the lungs. Breathing such dust each morning was not very different from inhaling construction materials. Yet in Victorian cosmetics, they were praised for their ability to lighten the complexion. Compared to modern times, it would be like grinding drywall into powder, mixing in perfume and calling it face powder. The thought is absurd, but to Victorians, it was an accepted form of beauty. Scented powders brought an extra risk. Essential oils or chemical fragrances were mixed into the dust, giving off strong scents. These smells might have covered body odour or created an impression of freshness, but they also made the irritation worse. Women sneezed constantly during and after application, yet still thought it was a mark of elegance to sneeze while holding a lace handkerchief dusted in powder was even seen as charming. The social acceptance of the ritual blinded people to the health damage it was causing. Servants again were crucial to the process. They ground the powders, sifted them, and filled fancy boxes with the fine dust. The grinding released thick clouds that coated their own throats and lungs long before the powders reached their mistresses' faces. They also cleaned the dressing tables each day, wiping away layers of residue that stuck to surfaces. While mistresses suffered long-term illness, servants often faced even greater exposure. Yet their health was ignored. I can't help but picture a maid coughing quietly as she grinds plaster into powder, preparing the very substance that will later harm both her and her mistress. The silence around these issues followed the same patterns seen with other hygiene practices. Nobody openly admitted that powders caused illness. Doctors occasionally noted the connection, but their warnings rarely reached households, and even when they did, they were dismissed. Women didn't want to believe that something so closely tied to beauty could hurt them. Families preferred to think of illness as fate rather than as the result of daily routines. The powders remained a trusted part of life, even as they caused coughing fits in parlours and ballrooms. Using powders went beyond the face. Some women dusted their entire bodies with the substances, rubbing powder under their arms, across their chests and down their legs. This was thought to control smell, absorb sweat, and keep skin smooth. But the more surface area was covered, the more dust filled the air. Bedrooms where women dressed each morning became choking clouds of powder, thick enough to hang around for hours. Curtains, carpets, and bedding caught the particles, turning the supposedly elegant rooms into constant sources of airborne irritants. The problem affected all classes. Rich ladies bought face powders shipped from Paris, finely milled and heavily perfumed, while working-class women used cheaper blends from street vendors. These discount powders often contained not just chalk, but lead too, turning beauty routines into poison sessions. No matter their social standing, the daily dusting ritual made breathing in these substances unavoidable. The poor hacked and wheezed in their tiny rooms, just like the wealthy coughed in their fancy drawing rooms. The only difference was how expensive the powder looked against their skin. Gradually, the persistent coughing, shortness of breath, and chest pains became impossible to dismiss. Many women passed away young, their lungs ruined. While their deaths were usually blamed on delicate health or family illnesses, few people wanted to link beauty practices with disease. Society picked silence again, choosing to preserve appearances instead of confronting reality. The pattern persisted, with each new generation learning these same routines from their mothers. The irony is remarkable. A culture fixated on moral cleanliness and proper appearance promoted habits that quietly killed its women. Face powder created the fantasy of porcelain-white, flawless skin, but underneath, it scarred airways and wrecked health. It was a mirage purchased at the ultimate price. Every morning, powders were crushed, smoothed on, and breathed in. Every night, coughing echoed through homes, overlooked or brushed aside. Women endured in silence, believing that sophistication required it, and while powders ravaged their breathing, the social events they frequented added yet another level of suffering, where cologne, perspiration, and liquor merged into stifling air that nobody dared escape. Evening social functions were the most eagerly awaited occasions of Victorian society. Formal dances, elegant receptions, and intimate soirees packed the schedules of the upper class, providing chances to showcase elaborate gowns, sparkling jewellery, and cultured manners. Yet beneath the glamour lay circumstances that were far from delightful. Dance halls were sealed tight to block the night breeze, since outdoor air was still thought to carry dangerous vapours. Windows remained closed, Thick drapes trapped the warmth, and countless bodies crowded the space. The outcome was a dense atmosphere where cologne, body odour and alcohol mixed into a scent that every attendee had to tolerate. Ladies wore elaborate dresses crafted from thick materials with numerous petticoats holding in heat and dampness. Moving beneath crystal chandeliers and gas flames only increased the burden, pushing temperatures higher. Inside already packed venues, gentlemen sported wool jackets and vests, garments that soaked up sweat but provided little airflow. Minutes into the dancing, faces glistened with moisture and clothing became soggy. But voicing complaints was unthinkable. To admit discomfort would appear impolite, shattering the fantasy that these events were graceful and effortless. It's nearly ridiculous that hundreds of people would perspire together quietly, maintaining elegance while standing in air thick enough to suffocate. Perfume, rather than improving things, made conditions worse. Women doused themselves in strong fragrances before arriving, hoping to hide any trace of natural scent. As dozens of competing perfumes blended in the confined area, the air became unbearable. Flowery notes clashed with earthy tones, jasmine with violet, until no individual fragrance remained recognizable. Instead, there existed only a heavy blanket of battling scents bearing down on everyone present. Guests bore it graciously, grinning and curtsying as if everything was fine, while privately battling the impulse to hack or retch. Alcohol contributed another dimension. Drink bowls, wine and hard liquor flowed freely, leaving the aroma of spirits on dancers' breath. Mixed with perfume and sweat, it produced what many later called the distinctive smell of Victorian gatherings. Staff weaved through the crowds, carrying beverage trays, their own clothing quickly drenched with the same blend of perspiration and spilled wine. They breathed the same toxic air, but had no option except to keep serving. If we compared it to today, it would be like packing everyone into an unventilated workout room, dousing them all with heavy cologne, passing around drinks, and then calling it sophistication. The physical damage was obvious. Guests collapsed frequently, especially women cinched tightly in corsets that limited their air intake. The terrible air quality only worsened things. When someone dropped, it wasn't considered shocking, but routine for the evening. Workers carried them away quietly, often bringing them around by holding vinegar-soaked rags under their noses. After a brief recovery, the guest was supposed to return to the party as if nothing had occurred. This pattern repeated nightly, accepted as standard. The hush around these situations reflected the silence in other hygiene areas. Nobody dared mention the stench or the heat. Doing so would have shattered the refinement illusion that balls were designed to create. The focus was image, not comfort. So ladies kept dancing with sweat running down their spines. Men drank until their cheeks flushed, and everyone inhaled air that grew thicker each hour. I can't help picturing the overwhelming scene. Silk gowns, sparkling chandeliers, and glittering gems, all gleaming above a room that reeked of fatigue and rot. Medical professionals and social reformers sometimes criticized the terrible ventilation in ballrooms, connecting it to fainting and sickness. But their concerns carried little influence. Party hosts wanted their estates viewed as stylish, and blocking fresh air was part of that look. Guests were supposed to appreciate the decorations, music, and company, not notice the choking conditions. Even when whole groups fainted during especially sweltering nights, the occasions were remembered as magnificent triumphs. The inconsistencies went even deeper. While society condemned coarseness in public and preached constantly about moral righteousness, it overlooked the reality of bodies crammed together, dripping with moisture, struggling for breath, and stinking of booze. What counted was not the actual experience, but the version told later. The grand celebrations were recalled as refined, even as those who attended them stumbled home, dizzy and sick. Each dance followed the same pattern. Guests arrived dusted and scented, ready to display their cultivation. Within 60 minutes, the air grew heavy, fabric stuck to flesh, and perfume became suffocation. Fainting episodes interrupted the festivities. Vinegar cloths revived the collapsed, and everyone continued. By dawn, gowns stank of sweat and alcohol, shoes were soaked, and heads pounded with exhaustion. But the fantasy was maintained, and the event was proclaimed a success. The ballrooms of that time became symbols not just of elegance, but of the weird relationship between appearance and misery. Guests tolerated the stink and discomfort without protest, convinced that silence was part of sophistication. And just as the parties left clothes saturated in perspiration, the very beds these people went home to offered no comfort, because even the linens and mattresses were seldom washed. The bedroom was meant to be the most personal and peaceful space in the home, yet in countless Victorian houses it was among the filthiest. Sheets, pillowcases and mattresses weren't laundered regularly, sometimes not for weeks or months. Changing bedding was thought to harm the body, as if replacing linens too frequently would sap what Victorians termed life force. Due to this belief, people often left their beds untouched until obvious stains emerged. What remained hidden? Hair, perspiration, dead skin, and smell was dismissed. The result was that women, celebrated for grace in sitting rooms and dance halls, slept nightly in beds that harboured filth. Bedding was heavy and challenging to wash. Cotton and linen sheets needed boiling water and hours of scrubbing, tasks assigned to household staff. Mattresses filled with down or horsehair were even more difficult to maintain. Cleaning them thoroughly was almost impossible, so they were occasionally had outside or beaten with rods to remove surface dirt. This method did little to clean the inside, which kept collecting sweat, oils and hair over time. It's almost ridiculous that a society so focused on decency accepted sleeping nightly in bedding saturated with months of grime. Hair was among the most frequent debris. Women lost strands daily, which got caught in sheets and pillows. Over weeks, these built up into clumps that stuck to fabric and stuffing alike. Servants removed them when changing linens, but usually the hair just remained where it landed. Along with it came pieces of dead skin, naturally shed as bodies moved during sleep. Combined, these formed a layer of waste that settled deeper into mattresses each night. Smell was another fixture. Human perspiration soaked into sheets and blankets, trapped there without frequent washing. Bodies released natural odours during rest, which combined with perfume, powder and oils remaining on skin. Eventually, the bed itself carried a sour stench that couldn't be hidden. To those sleeping in it, the odour became an invisible part of daily existence. To visitors, it was clear and disgusting, yet nobody mentioned it openly because cleanliness remained a private issue, never questioned in proper society. The presence of pets worsened the problem. Some women kept small dogs or cats in their bedrooms, allowing them to sleep on the same sheets they used. The animals shed fur, brought fleas, and sometimes worse. Mattresses absorbed everything, yet this was accepted, even seen as loving, another mark of refinement. The notion of animals adding to the mess was ignored. To object would have seemed cruel, and kindness to pets was viewed as a sign of good character. If we compared it to today, it would be like never washing your bedding for months, letting pets sleep on it nightly, and still calling it a restful place. Servants again carried the load. They hauled heavy sheets to wash only when commanded, often after visible stains showed up. They beat mattresses outdoors in dust clouds, their lungs filling with months of residue. They attempted to mask odours with herb sprigs or lavender sachets tucked into fabric folds. These were minor efforts meant only to create the appearance of cleanliness. The actual filth stayed put. I can't help thinking how exhausting it must have been for servants to drag wet sheets across yards, knowing the beds would return to filth within days. Physicians occasionally cautioned about the health dangers of dirty beds. They observed that breathing problems, skin irritations, and infections spread easily when beds went unchanged. Still, the warnings did little to change behaviours. The belief that frequent washing drained energy was stronger than medical guidance. Even families who could pay for regular cleaning chose to skip it. The bed remained contradictory, a place of supposed rest that quietly damaged health. Middle and working class families faced even worse realities. With fewer linens, they rotated the same set until it wore out. Sheets were mended instead of replaced, often rigid with layers of dirt. Mattresses were rarely changed, becoming heavy with years of built-up grime. Kids shared beds, spreading lice and fleas among them. In cramped homes, entire families sometimes shared one mattress, which absorbed the sweat and smell of every person. Privacy didn't exist, and cleanliness was impossible. Superstition was crucial in keeping these practices alive. Many Victorians believed that changing sheets too often disturbed the body's balance. Just as they mistrusted fresh air, they mistrusted excessive cleaning. Change came slowly, fought by tradition and silence. To discuss bedroom filth was to violate propriety, so everyone pretended not to see. The culture of silence protected even the most disgusting conditions. Guests sometimes learned the truth when staying overnight. Beds offered to them carried the same smells and debris, but manners prevented complaints. To bring it up would have insulted their host. Visitors suffered the discomfort quietly, just as families endured it daily. The illusion of refinement survived, even as the reality was completely different. Over time, the effects became undeniable. Diseases spread in crowded households, children died from infections, and women suffered ongoing discomfort. Yet still the sheets remained unchanged, the mattresses unwashed. Lavender sachets and perfume sprays disguised the smell briefly, but they couldn't eliminate the deeper filth. The ritual of cleanliness was once more revealed as fantasy, preserved at health's expense. Each night, women lay down in beds filled with dust, hair, and sweat. Pets curled next to them, fleas crawled through the sheets, and odours hung in the air. They dreamed of refinement while their bodies absorbed the reality of neglect. By morning, they rose to dust their faces, scent their clothes, and continue the cycle of appearances. Beds stayed unwashed, sheets grew stiff with grime, and mattresses sagged under years of weight. Families tolerated it, convinced that silence and superstition were safer than cleanliness. And just as nobody spoke of bedroom filth, nobody dared mention the smells of the body itself, odours that society agreed to ignore, even though everyone lived with them. Victorian society flourished on appearances, and the silence around hygiene was one of its most startling contradictions. People lived in tight spaces with smells, filth, and decay, yet they collectively agreed to say nothing. Body odour was everywhere. Menstrual blood was concealed awkwardly. Hair went unwashed, and clothes absorbed everything without ever being truly cleaned. Still, the image of refinement was shown to the world. Women smiled at dining tables, their dresses flowing, their faces powdered, and their voices pleasant, even as everyone in the room knew the reality. Beneath the surface, silence was a shared understanding, an invisible rule everyone obeyed. The smells were impossible to miss. Sweat clung to bodies wrapped in heavy layers, and no amount of perfume could completely mask it. Rooms filled with stale air and musty scents that everyone recognized. Menstrual odour was there too, soaked into cloth rags that were poorly washed or tucked away. Hair, rarely cleaned, carried the sharp smell of powder and grease. These things weren't secrets. Everyone encountered them daily, yet they were treated as non-existent. It's almost unbelievable that an entire society pretended not to smell what was directly before them. The silence itself became a way to survive. To speak openly of such things was to risk shame. Servants noticed, neighbours noticed, family members noticed, but nobody dared point it out. A woman could collapse from ballroom stench, get up with a smile, and keep dancing as if nothing occurred. A wife could sleep in a bed that stank of sweat and mildew, then wake to entertain guests without ever mentioning her room's condition. Politeness demanded denial. Respectability required silence. This culture of ignoring filth spread across all social levels. The wealthy hid behind velvet drapes and lace trim. The poor endured in overcrowded rooms. But both lived with identical smells. A woman in a silk dress was no cleaner than one in patched cotton. Both sweated under heavy clothing, both absorbed odours into unwashed fabrics, and both suffered the same neglect. Yet the fantasy of difference continued, supported by silence. If we compared it to today, it would be like everyone agreeing to wear stain-covered clothes while calling them spotless, simply because nobody dared say otherwise. The health impact was constant, infections spread quietly, rashes persisted, and breathing illnesses thrived in rooms full of dust and mould. But again, silence won. To acknowledge sickness as hygiene's result would have meant admitting that society itself was broken. Instead, illness was blamed on weak health, bad fortune, or destiny. This denial let the same practices continue generation after generation. The hypocrisy was remarkable. This was a culture that preached endlessly about morality, purity, and self-discipline. Women were judged harshly for the tiniest etiquette mistakes. Yet the same society tolerated filth in bedrooms, dresses worn for months without cleaning, and bodies perfumed instead of washed. Appearances mattered more than truth, and silence protected the contradiction. I can't help reflecting on the strange burden of the silence. How entire households must have lived day after day, surrounded by smells and filth, all while pretending nothing was wrong. Even laughter and conversation were shaped by this silence. In parlours, women sat together, their gowns rustling, their hair powdered, their hands holding perfumed handkerchiefs. They discussed politics, art, or gossip, but never the odours clinging to their own bodies. In ballrooms, couples danced close together, sweating in the heat, yet smiling as if the stench was invisible. Everyone knew, but nobody spoke. The silence was heavy, louder than any words could be. The truth wasn't entirely hidden. Writers and physicians occasionally hinted at it. Servants whispered quietly among themselves, though never around employers. Satirical magazines sometimes mocked the dependence on perfume or powders. But these voices were weak compared to the thunder of silence that shaped daily life. The culture of denial was too powerful, and appearances were too precious to risk. This final reality reveals Victorian hygiene's core. It wasn't simply about neglect, but about collective refusal. The refusal to acknowledge, the refusal to face, and the refusal to change. Women, men, and children all lived with it, building their lives around unspoken rules. To stay quiet was to belong, to speak was to be crude, and so silence became society's law, wrapping everyone in the same heavy fantasy. Every smell was ignored, every stain was concealed, every discomfort was endured. Nods, smiles, and pleasant conversation replaced honesty. The silence allowed society to move forward without facing its own contradictions. But for those who lived it, the silence must have been choking, heavier even than the clothes they wore or the air they breathed. As we look back now, the silence itself might be the most telling detail of all. It shows us how much people would endure for appearance's sake, how far society went to protect its fantasies. Victorian hygiene was revolting, but even more shocking was the agreement never to mention it. And so we end this journey into the hidden world of Victorian women's hygiene, a world where perfume replaced water, where dresses were worn for weeks without washing, where beds reeked of sweat and mould, and where silence covered everything. It's a reminder that behind every elegant portrait and polished ballroom lies discomfort, filth, and denial. Thank you for listening to this story of appearances, silence, and hidden truths. May it leave you with a picture of the past that isn't polished but genuine. And as you rest tonight, may your bed be clean, your air be fresh, and your sleep free from the weight of silence. Good night and sleep well.